There's a coffee shop across the street from this hotel in Preston, where I've been spending most of my afternoons, just sitting by the window watching people go about their ordinary lives. They look so normal, so unconcerned, and I find myself wondering if any of them have ever done something they can't take back. Something that keeps them awake at 3 a.m, going over every decision they made. I used to be a video editor, corporate videos mostly, the sort of promotional content that companies use for their websites and training materials. Boring work, but steady, and it paid well enough for me to afford a decent flat in Manchester and the occasional holiday abroad. Then I lost that contract when the company moved their marketing department in-house, and I spent a few desperate months taking whatever freelance work I could find. That's how I ended up editing videos for people I never met. Content I should never have agreed to work on. Material that's now being used in ways I'm only just beginning to understand. I've been hiding here for nearly 3 weeks, moving hotels every few days, trying to work out if anyone knows I finally realized what those videos were actually for. The redundancy came at the worst possible time. I'd just renewed my lease for another year and had committed to a holiday in Greece that summer. I was 46 years old with nearly 20 years of editing experience, but the market was saturated with younger people who'd work for half what I charged and knew software I'd never bothered learning. I spent the first month applying for staff positions, then started lowering my standards to contract work, then freelance projects, then eventually anything that involved editing video for money. My savings were disappearing faster than I'd expected, and by the 3rd month I was genuinely worried about making rent. That's when I found the posting on a freelance website. Someone needed an experienced video editor for what they described as documentary projects requiring discretion and professional finishing. The rate was exceptional, about double what I'd been charging before my redundancy, and they needed someone who could start immediately on a series of ongoing projects. The client, who identified himself only as Mr. Harris, explained during our initial phone conversation that his projects involved sensitive subject matter that required absolute confidentiality. He represented a collective of documentary makers who operated in areas where mainstream media outlets were reluctant to venture. They needed editors who could work with raw footage and transform it into polished professional content without asking uncomfortable questions about how the footage was obtained or what it would ultimately be used for. I should have questioned what kind of documentary projects required such secretive arrangements. Should have wondered why legitimate filmmakers wouldn't just work with established editing houses. But Mr. Harris was offering steady work at rates I desperately needed, and I convinced myself that documentary makers often dealt with controversial subjects that required discretion from everyone involved. The first project arrived via encrypted file transfer, about 2 hours of raw footage showing the exterior of various residential properties. Mr. Harris wanted me to edit it into a 12-minute video, removing duplicate shots, stabilizing the camera work, and adding subtle background music that would give it a professional documentary feel. The footage was unremarkable, just static shots of houses from different angles taken at various times of day. I assumed it was B-roll for some property development documentary or neighborhood study. I edited it according to the brief, tightened the pacing, color-corrected the footage to make it look more professional, and delivered the finished video within the deadline. Mr. Harris was pleased with my work and immediately sent me another project. This one included footage of people going about their daily routines, leaving their homes, getting into cars, walking to local shops. Again, I edited it into a polished short documentary, assuming it was part of some anthropological study or social observation project. The work continued steadily over the following weeks. I'd receive raw footage of various subjects, properties, people, public spaces, and edit them into professional-looking short documentaries. The pay was excellent, the deadlines were reasonable, and I was grateful to have found steady work that utilized my skills. But I started noticing patterns in the footage that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Many of the videos focused on elderly people living alone, documenting their routines with obsessive detail. Others showed children playing in gardens or walking to school, filmed from positions that suggested the camera operator was concealing themselves. When I questioned Mr. Harris about the nature of these documentary projects, he explained they were studying vulnerable populations to better understand social isolation and community support needs. The footage was being used to develop interventions and support services for at-risk individuals. That explanation seemed plausible enough, though I was troubled by the covert nature of the filming. Surely legitimate social research would require informed consent from subjects, not secret surveillance. But Mr. Harris assured me the research ethics had been properly managed and my role was simply to edit the footage professionally, not to concern myself with research methodology. I accepted that explanation because I needed to believe the work was legitimate. The money was keeping me financially stable, and I'd developed a routine that felt almost like having a real job again. I couldn't afford to lose the income by asking uncomfortable questions that might cost me the contract. The projects became more specific and disturbing. Instead of general observation footage, I was editing videos that focused on particular individuals with obsessive detail. One project involved editing dozens of hours of footage showing a woman's daily routine. Leaving for work, returning home, grocery shopping, everything she did visible from public spaces. I edited it into a comprehensive profile video showing her predictable routine, her apparent vulnerabilities, her moments of inattention. The finished product looked like professional surveillance documentation, not a social research project. But Mr. Harris insisted this was part of studying patterns of behavior in women living alone, research that would inform safety recommendations. Another project focused on an elderly couple, documenting their movements, their visitors, their weekly routines. I edited it to highlight times when they were alone, security vulnerabilities in their property, even their apparent physical limitations that might make them easy targets for what exactly? I was starting to understand that these weren't documentary projects at all. The breakthrough came when I recognized a house in some footage Mr. Harris sent me. It was my neighbor's house in Manchester, filmed from the street and back alley with the same obsessive attention to detail I'd been seeing in other projects. The footage documented when my neighbor left for work, when she returned, which lights she turned on in the evening, even which windows she left open during warm weather. I realized immediately that I'd been editing surveillance footage for people planning to target specific individuals for burglary, harassment, or worse. The professional documentary style I'd been providing wasn't for legitimate research. It was making criminal intelligence gathering look polished and systematic for people who were planning serious crimes. I thought about all the other projects I'd edited over the past few months, all the individuals whose routines I documented with professional editing techniques that made surveillance footage look like carefully crafted observations. Each video I'd finished had probably enabled someone to be targeted by criminals who used my editing to study their victims before attacking them. But what made it unbearable was understanding that my professional skills had made the surveillance more effective. The raw footage Mr. Harris sent me was often shaky, poorly framed, amateurish. My editing transformed it into clear, professional documentation that would be far more useful for planning criminal activity. I'd taken rough intelligence gathering and turned it into comprehensive surveillance reports. I tried to refuse further projects, but Mr. Harris made it clear that walking away wasn't a simple option. I'd been working for months. Editing footage I must have understood wasn't for legitimate purposes. I'd accepted substantial payment for work that had facilitated criminal activity against dozens of people. If I caused problems now, he'd ensure the authorities understood my role in enabling what the surveillance had been used for. I was being threatened with my own complicity. The evidence of my editing work showed months of professional collaboration with people conducting criminal surveillance, even though I hadn't fully understood what I was doing initially. The pattern was clear enough that claiming ignorance wouldn't protect me from prosecution. That's when I started keeping copies of all the projects I'd edited, documenting the subjects and the detailed surveillance I'd helped create. I told myself I was preserving evidence, but really I was just trying to feel less guilty about the harm I'd enabled. The videos I'd edited weren't just being used for immediate criminal purposes. They were being shared and sold to multiple people through hidden internet marketplaces I discovered when Mr. Harris accidentally sent me a wrong link. My professionally edited surveillance videos were being treated as commodities, sold to anyone willing to pay for detailed intelligence about specific individuals. I found entire libraries of surveillance videos organized by location, demographic, and vulnerability type. Elderly people living alone, single parents, isolated individuals, all documented with the sort of professional editing I'd been providing. Each video had detailed descriptions of the subject's routines, vulnerabilities, and potential approaches for exploitation. Some videos I recognized from my own editing work. Others were clearly created by different editors, but followed similar professional standards. There was an entire industry of surveillance video production, with editors like me transforming raw footage into marketable intelligence products. But what disturbed me most was discovering how the videos were being used. They weren't just enabling individual burglaries or harassment campaigns. They were being used to coordinate systematic targeting of vulnerable people across the country. Groups would purchase multiple surveillance videos, then coordinate their activities to maximize the impact and minimize the risk of detection. One discussion thread focused on using surveillance videos to identify elderly people who could be targeted through distraction burglary techniques. Members shared the videos they'd purchased, discussing which subjects showed the most promising vulnerabilities and planning coordinated campaigns across different regions. Another section dealt with using surveillance videos to identify women living alone who could be targeted for stalking or worse. Users compared videos, rated subjects based on vulnerability, even discussed techniques for escalating from remote surveillance to direct contact. I was looking at evidence that my editing work had enabled systematic criminal targeting of vulnerable people, and that the professional quality I'd provided had made the surveillance more valuable and marketable. Every technical skill I'd applied, every professional flourish I'd added, it had all increased the commercial value of criminal intelligence about innocent people. The woman whose daily routine I'd edited into that comprehensive profile had subsequently been stalked for months by someone who'd purchased the video through the marketplace. The elderly couple I documented had been burgled 3 times, with the thieves showing intimate knowledge of their routines and vulnerabilities. My neighbor in Manchester had become a target after footage of her house appeared in the marketplace. I'd seen suspicious people watching her property, cars that didn't belong in the area parked outside her house at odd hours. She'd mentioned feeling unsafe, but couldn't explain why. Had no evidence of actual threats, just a growing sense that something wasn't right. I knew exactly why she felt that way. Surveillance footage of her home had been professionally edited into a targeting package that documented her every vulnerability. And I was the one who'd done that editing, who'd transformed raw surveillance into the sort of polished product that maximized its criminal value. I tried contacting the police about what I'd discovered, but explaining my role without admitting extensive complicity proved impossible. I'd been editing surveillance footage for months. Accepting substantial payment for work I should have recognized wasn't legitimate. The videos I'd created had facilitated serious crimes against real people. The officer I spoke to was professional but frank. Cooperation might be valuable for their investigation, but I shouldn't expect immunity from prosecution for my role in creating and distributing criminal surveillance materials. I'd been an active participant in an operation that had enabled serious harm to vulnerable people. I was advised to stop accepting editing work immediately and refuse further contact with Mr. Harris. But he'd already anticipated that possibility. I started receiving messages reminding me of our confidentiality agreement, emphasizing the documentation they had of my editing work, suggesting that creating problems would result in both legal consequences and more personal difficulties. The harassment escalated when I didn't respond. I received packages containing screenshots from the marketplace showing videos I'd edited, with annotations detailing crimes those videos had enabled. They were documenting my complicity systematically, building a case that would destroy my life if I tried to report their operations. Then I found my own address listed in the marketplace. Someone had created surveillance footage of my flat in Manchester, professionally edited in the same style I'd been using for months. My daily routine, my vulnerabilities, my security arrangements, all documented with the same obsessive detail I'd been applying to others. I was now a product in the marketplace I'd been supplying. My own life reduced to a surveillance video that could be purchased by anyone wanting to target me. The professional editing standards I'd established were being applied to my own surveillance, ensuring the footage would be maximally useful for anyone who bought it. That's when I left Manchester entirely, abandoning my flat and most of my possessions to hide in hotels across the north. I've been moving every few days, paying cash where possible, avoiding any digital traces that might help them track my location. But I know the surveillance videos I edited are still being sold and used. Other editors have probably been recruited to replace me. People who'll make the same rationalizations I did about just doing professional editing work, without responsibility for how the videos are used. The marketplace is probably still growing, still selling professional surveillance documentation to anyone willing to pay for intelligence about vulnerable targets. And somewhere in that marketplace, surveillance footage of me is being offered to people who've been told I know too much about their operations. I keep thinking about my neighbor, about the elderly couple who were burgled, about all the other people whose surveillance I edited into professional targeting packages. They went about their normal lives never knowing that someone had documented their every movement, that an editor had transformed that surveillance into marketable intelligence. The videos taught me that professional skills can be weaponized, that technical expertise becomes complicit when applied to criminal purposes, regardless of your intentions or understanding. That every color correction I made, every transition I added, every professional flourish I applied, it all increased the harm those videos could enable. And that once you've spent months editing surveillance footage you should have recognized wasn't legitimate, you become too compromised to report it without destroying your own life. The evidence of your professional collaboration is permanent, documented in videos that show your technical fingerprints on materials that enabled serious crimes. I suppose that's why I'm sitting in this Preston hotel watching normal people in coffee shops, rather than going back to police with all the evidence I preserved, because I know that evidence implicates me as thoroughly as it exposes the marketplace, and I'm not brave enough to face consequences for choices I made when I convinced myself I was just doing professional editing work. All I can do is hope that someone else will eventually expose these operations that other editors will find the courage I lack to report what they're creating despite the personal cost, and hope that the people whose surveillance I edited so professionally managed to stay safe despite the targeting packages I helped create. Because the marketplace is still operating, still recruiting editors, still selling professional surveillance documentation to criminals who use it to target vulnerable people. And I helped establish the standards, helped prove that surveillance footage has more value when it's been professionally edited, helped create an industry that treats people's private lives as raw materials for criminal intelligence products. I just wish I could undo it all, could warn every person whose surveillance I edited, could take back every professional flourish I added to footage that was used to destroy people's sense of safety. But I can't. So I just keep moving between hotels and watching people in coffee shops, wondering if they've ever done something they can't take back, something that haunts them every day they continue living with the consequences of their choices. Imagine thinking you're helping someone find their missing dog, and 3 months later discovering you've been part of something that makes your stomach turn every time you close your eyes. That's essentially what happened to me, though it took far longer than it should have for me to piece together what I'd actually been doing. I should probably explain how I ended up involved in the first place, though I'm still not entirely comfortable admitting how naive I was about the whole thing. Last spring, I was between jobs after being made redundant from my position at a marketing firm in Birmingham. The severance wasn't terrible, but it wasn't going to last forever, and I'd been putting off the inevitable return to job hunting by convincing myself I deserved a proper break after 15 years of office work. My mate Craig had mentioned in passing that he'd been earning a bit of extra cash doing odd jobs for people online. Nothing elaborate, just simple tasks that required someone local to handle things in person. Collecting parcels from collection points when people were away, checking on properties during holidays, that sort of thing. He made it sound straightforward enough, and the money wasn't insignificant for what seemed like minimal effort. The website he'd found these opportunities through wasn't anything I'd heard of before, but it looked legitimate enough. Clean design, proper contact information, testimonials from other users. The registration process required proof of identity and address, which actually reassured me that they were taking security seriously. Within a week, I'd been approved and had access to the job listings in my area. Most of the tasks were exactly what Craig had described: simple collection and delivery work, house-sitting arrangements, occasional help with moving furniture. The pay was decent, usually between £20 and £50 for a few hours' work, and the clients seemed genuinely appreciative. I found myself with a small but steady income stream that kept me occupied whilst I half-heartedly searched for proper employment. The request that changed everything appeared in my inbox on a Tuesday morning in late May. A woman named Sarah needed someone to help distribute missing pet flyers around various locations in and around Coventry. Her dog, a golden retriever called Max, had gone missing from her garden 3 weeks earlier, and despite her best efforts, she hadn't had any luck finding him. She was offering £40 for a day's work putting up posters and handing out flyers in busy areas. What struck me about the request was how desperate she sounded in her message. She explained that Max was getting on in years and needed medication for a heart condition. Every day he was missing reduced the chances of finding him alive. She'd already covered the immediate area around her home, but needed someone to extend the search radius to places she couldn't reach easily due to work commitments. I responded that same day, and Sarah got back to me almost immediately. She lived in a village outside Coventry and worked long hours at a care home. which explained why she needed help covering more ground. The plan was simple enough. She'd prepare packages of flyers and poster materials for specific locations, and I'd collect them from a designated pickup point and distribute them according to her instructions. The first collection point was a small industrial estate on the outskirts of the city. Sarah had left the materials in a weatherproof box behind a particular building, exactly where she'd said they'd be. Inside were several bundles of flyers with Max's photo and contact details, along with a roll of posters and some tape for putting them up on lampposts and notice boards. The distribution locations were clearly marked on a simple map she'd included. Shopping centers, parks, residential areas, train stations. All places where missing pet posters would be perfectly normal and where people might have seen a lost dog. I spent the better part of the day covering the route she'd outlined, putting up posters in prominent locations and handing out flyers to anyone who seemed receptive. It felt good to be doing something genuinely helpful for someone in distress. I'd had pets myself over the years and could imagine how frantic I'd be if one of them went missing. Sarah had included her mobile number on all the materials, and I found myself hoping she'd receive some useful calls as a result of the extended search area. She paid promptly through the website system and sent a grateful message thanking me for my thoroughness. She also mentioned that she was planning to expand the search even further and asked if I'd be available for similar work the following week. The money was useful, and I felt like I was making a genuine difference, so I agreed immediately. The second week followed the same pattern. Collection from a different industrial estate, this time closer to Leicester, with the materials for locations in that area. The flyers were identical to the previous week's batch, though Sarah had updated the missing date to reflect that Max had now been gone for nearly a month. She'd also increased the reward amount from £200 to £500, which suggested she was becoming increasingly desperate. I covered the Leicester route as thoroughly as I had the first one, and again Sarah seemed pleased with my work. Her messages were becoming more frequent though, and I could sense the growing anxiety in her words. She mentioned that she'd had a few calls from the first week's flyers, but none had led to any concrete sightings of Max. By the third week, I was starting to feel genuinely invested in the search. Sarah had expanded the operation again, this time covering areas around Nottingham and Derby. The collection points were always industrial estates or retail parks on the edges of cities, places where someone could leave materials without attracting attention. The routine had become familiar. Collect the packages, follow the prescribed routes, distribute everything according to her detailed instructions. It was during the fourth week that I first noticed something that seemed slightly odd. I was collecting materials from a car park behind a furniture warehouse when I saw someone else doing what looked like exactly the same thing I was doing. A middle-aged man was loading boxes from a similar weatherproof container into his car boot, and when he saw me looking, he gave me a nod that suggested mutual recognition of shared purpose. I didn't think much of it at the time. It made sense that Sarah would have recruited multiple people to help with the search, especially given how wide an area she was now trying to cover. If anything, it was encouraging to know that Max's disappearance was being taken so seriously and that Sarah had the resources to organize such an extensive effort. The following week brought another slight change to the routine. Instead of collecting from one location and covering one area, I was given materials for 3 different routes in 3 different cities. The packages were more substantial now, enough flyers and posters for several days' work, and the pay had increased accordingly. Sarah explained that she'd received some promising leads and wanted to saturate certain areas with as much coverage as possible, whilst the trail was still warm. I was happy to take on the extra work, and the money was definitely welcome. What I didn't expect was how organized the whole operation had become. Each package now included detailed schedules showing optimal times for different locations, priority areas marked clearly on the maps, and even suggestions for the most effective approaches to use when handing out flyers to members of the public. The level of planning was impressive, though it did make me wonder how Sarah was managing to coordinate all of this whilst working full-time at a care home. The schedules alone must have taken considerable research and preparation. But then again, people will go to extraordinary lengths when their beloved pets are missing, and perhaps she'd taken time off work to focus on the search effort. It was around the 7th week that I started encountering other people doing similar work with increasing frequency, not just the occasional glimpse in a car park, but regular sightings of individuals following what appeared to be the same type of systematic approach I was using. Same weatherproof collection containers, same methodical distribution patterns, same professional-looking flyers and materials. At a shopping centre in Sheffield, I watched a woman spend 40 minutes covering the car park with the same methodical precision I'd been trained to use. At a train station in Leeds, I saw a man distributing what looked like identical materials to mine, though I was too far away to see the details clearly. The operation was clearly much larger than I'd initially realized. I began to pay more attention to the other people I encountered during my work, and a pattern started to emerge. We were all roughly the same demographic, middle-aged, professional-looking, the sort of people who would blend in easily in any environment, and who wouldn't attract suspicion when approaching strangers with flyers. We all worked with the same quiet efficiency, following our prescribed routes without deviation or apparent improvisation. The thought occurred to me that I'd never actually spoken to Sarah directly. All our communication had been through the website's messaging system, and whilst her messages were personal and emotional, I'd never heard her voice or had any contact that couldn't have been mediated through text. For someone supposedly desperate to find her missing pet, she seemed remarkably organized and systematic in her approach. I decided to do a bit of research into missing pets in the Coventry area. If Max's disappearance was genuine, there would likely be other online traces of the search effort. Social media posts, local newspaper coverage, appeals on community websites. Dogs don't just vanish without leaving some kind of digital footprint in today's connected world. What I found when I searched for missing golden retrievers named Max in the Coventry area was absolutely nothing. No Facebook posts, no local news stories, no appeals on community forums or lost pet websites. For such an apparently extensive and well-funded search operation, there was a complete absence of any other evidence that it existed. I expanded my search to include the surrounding areas and different variations of the dog's name and description. Still nothing. I tried searching for missing pets in the specific locations where I'd been distributing flyers, thinking perhaps Sarah had been less precise about the area in her communications with me. Again, no results that matched the information I'd been given. The absence of any corroborating evidence began to trouble me more than I wanted to admit. I told myself that not everyone uses social media to search for missing pets, and that Sarah might be a private person who preferred to handle the situation without public appeals. But the complete lack of any online trace seemed increasingly unlikely given the scale and organization of the operation I'd been participating in. I decided to take a closer look at one of the flyers during my next collection, examining it more carefully than I had before. The photo of Max was professional quality, the kind of perfectly composed portrait that suggested it had been taken in a studio rather than in someone's back garden. The contact information looked legitimate enough, but something about the overall presentation struck me as too polished for a genuine missing pet appeal. More concerning was what I noticed when I compared flyers from different weeks. Whilst the basic design remained the same, small details were subtly different from batch to batch. The reward amount varied. The missing date sometimes shifted by a few days, and in one case, I was certain the dog's age had changed from 8 years old to 10 years old between distributions. These inconsistencies could have been simple mistakes made by someone under stress, but they could also suggest something more troubling. I began to wonder if the materials I'd been distributing were being used to test different approaches or gather different types of response, rather than to genuinely search for a missing pet. The realization that I might not have been helping Sarah find her lost dog was disturbing enough, but it raised the question of what I had actually been doing during those weeks of systematic distributions. Why would someone want hundreds of people distributed across multiple cities to hand out materials that weren't what they appeared to be? What was the real purpose of such an elaborate and expensive operation? I started paying closer attention to the locations I'd been asked to cover, looking for patterns that might reveal the true intent behind the distributions. Shopping centers, transport hubs, residential areas near schools, places where families gathered. All locations where approaching strangers wouldn't seem suspicious, and where someone could observe interactions and responses without attracting attention. The possibility that occurred to me was too uncomfortable to initially accept, but it explained everything I'd observed: the systematic approach, the multiple operatives, the constantly shifting details on the materials, the focus on busy, family-oriented locations. Someone was using the missing pet story as cover for something that resembled surveillance or intelligence gathering on a significant scale. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. The dark web, which I'd only heard about in passing, supposedly contained marketplaces for all sorts of illegal activities. If someone wanted to gather information about people's routines, their responses to approaches from strangers, or their willingness to help in certain situations, this would be an almost perfect methodology. The missing pet angle was particularly clever because it encouraged people to provide detailed information about their own movements and observations. Anyone who responded to the flyers would likely share when and where they thought they might have seen the dog, essentially mapping out their own daily routines and favorite locations. Information that could be valuable to someone with less innocent intentions. I stopped accepting jobs from Sarah immediately, claiming I'd found full-time employment and was no longer available for freelance work. Her response was understanding but disappointed, and she asked if I knew anyone else who might be interested in helping with the continuing search. I politely declined to provide any referrals. Over the following weeks, I found myself paying attention to missing pet appeals with a new and uncomfortable awareness. How many of them were genuine, and how many might be sophisticated data collection operations? The thought that I'd unknowingly participated in something that could potentially be used to harm the same families I thought I was helping made me feel physically sick. I never reported my suspicions to the police because I had no concrete evidence that anything illegal had actually occurred. The materials I distributed were professionally produced and seemed legitimate on the surface. The payments I'd received were processed through official channels and properly declared for tax purposes. On paper, everything appeared entirely legal. But I know what I experienced during those weeks, and I know how systematic and extensive the operation was. I know that dozens of other people were doing exactly the same work I was doing, covering hundreds of locations across multiple cities with materials that contained inconsistent information about a dog that apparently never existed. I still think about Sarah sometimes, I'm certain that wasn't her real name. I wonder if she was even aware of how her operation appeared to someone on the ground, or if the missing pet story was just another layer of deception in something much larger and more concerning. I wonder how many other people like me are still out there, thinking they're helping reunite families with beloved pets, whilst actually participating in something entirely different. The worst part is not knowing what the real purpose was, or what might have been done with whatever information was gathered through those carefully orchestrated distributions. I tell myself that perhaps it was market research or social psychology study, something benign that just used unusual methodology. But I can't shake the feeling that I was part of something much darker, something that someone had taken considerable trouble to disguise as an act of compassion. These days, I'm more careful about the jobs I accept and the people I trust. I've learned that the internet makes it frighteningly easy for people to create convincing facades for activities that might be far from what they appear. I've learned that legitimate-looking websites and professional quality materials don't guarantee that something is actually legitimate. Most importantly, I've learned that sometimes the most effective disguises are the ones that make you feel good about participating. The missing pet story was perfect because it appealed to people's natural desire to help and their emotional connection to animals. It made questioning the operation feel almost cruel, like doubting someone's genuine distress. I probably should have been more suspicious from the beginning, but hindsight makes everything seem obvious. At the time, helping someone find their lost dog seemed like the most natural thing in the world. I wanted to believe I was making a difference, and that desire made me overlook details that should have raised immediate red flags. I still check missing pet websites occasionally, looking for any sign that Max was real and that my cynicism about the whole operation was unfounded. I keep hoping to see his photo appear in a genuine appeal, or to find evidence that Sarah was exactly who she claimed to be. But deep down, I know that's not going to happen. The truth is that I'll probably never know for certain what I was really doing during those weeks of systematic distributions. I'll never know if my participation contributed to anything harmful, or if my suspicions were entirely unfounded. What I do know is that the experience has fundamentally changed how I think about trust and vulnerability in our increasingly connected world. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm checking the locks on my doors, I wonder if the people who organized that operation know that I figured out what they were really doing. I wonder if they're still out there, running similar operations with different covers, exploiting other people's desire to help and their natural compassion for animals or missing persons. The worst part about grief is how it makes you stupid. When you're barely functioning after losing someone close to you, and someone offers you a way to connect with people who understand exactly what you're going through, you don't question why they know so much about your personal situation or why they seem so eager to help. You just grab onto anything that might make the pain stop, even if it means trusting strangers who probably shouldn't be trusted. My wife Emma died in a car accident on the M4 near Reading in February last year. One minute we were planning a weekend away in Bath, and the next minute I was sitting in a hospital corridor being told that nothing could be done. The grief hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. I tried going back to work at the engineering firm in Reading, where I'd been for nearly 10 years, but I kept breaking down in meetings or staring blankly at technical drawings that might as well have been written in ancient Greek. My manager suggested I take extended compassionate leave, which was probably the kindest way of saying I was completely useless to them in my current state. The NHS grief counselling had an 8-month waiting list, which felt like a cruel joke when you could barely get through 8 hours without falling apart. My GP prescribed antidepressants and suggested I might benefit from peer support groups, but most of the local bereavement services seemed to be run by well-meaning volunteers who had never lost anyone important themselves. That's when I received the letter about the specialist grief support program. It arrived about 6 weeks after Emma's funeral, addressed to me personally, and explaining that they provided intensive support for people dealing with sudden loss of spouses or partners. The letter demonstrated remarkable knowledge of my specific circumstances, mentioning details about Emma's accident and my current emotional state that I couldn't remember sharing with anyone outside my immediate family. The program was described as a cutting-edge approach to grief therapy that combined traditional counseling with modern technology and peer support networks. They offered immediate access to qualified grief specialists and connection with others who had experienced similar losses without the lengthy waiting periods typical of NHS services. The letter included a phone number and website address for more information. When I visited the website, I found professional-looking materials about innovative grief therapy techniques and testimonials from people who claimed the program had been life-changing during their darkest periods. I called the number and spoke to a counselor named Sarah, who seemed to understand exactly what I was going through. She asked insightful questions about my relationship with Emma and my current coping mechanisms, demonstrating genuine empathy and professional knowledge about grief psychology. Sarah explained that their program used a holistic approach that addressed both the emotional and practical aspects of losing a life partner. They provided individual counseling, group support sessions, and access to online communities where people could connect with others facing similar challenges. The online component was particularly appealing because it meant I could access support at any time of day or night when the grief felt overwhelming. Sarah explained that they used private platforms that provided enhanced security and privacy for participants who needed to share very personal experiences without fear of judgment or exposure. I agreed to participate in the program and was sent detailed instructions for accessing their online support communities. The setup process required downloading specialized software that would connect me to private grief support networks that weren't accessible through normal internet browsing. Sarah explained that the enhanced privacy measures were necessary because grief support required sharing extremely personal and vulnerable information. The private networks ensured that participants could communicate openly without worrying about unauthorized access to their emotional disclosures. The individual counseling sessions with Sarah were genuinely helpful. She seemed skilled at grief therapy techniques and provided practical strategies for managing the daily challenges of living without Emma. The support felt professional and compassionate, and I began to feel like I was making some progress in processing my loss. The online support communities were also beneficial initially. I connected with other people who had lost spouses in sudden accidents, and sharing experiences with people who truly understood what I was going through felt more valuable than any professional therapy I had received. However, I began noticing unusual aspects of the online communities that didn't quite fit with typical grief support services. Many participants seemed to have access to remarkably detailed personal information about each other's circumstances, including details that wouldn't normally be shared in support group settings. Some conversations included references to my daily routine, financial situation, and family relationships that I hadn't disclosed during my participation in the support communities. The level of background knowledge that other participants seemed to have about my personal life was concerning and suggested that information was being gathered from sources beyond what I had voluntarily shared. When I mentioned these observations to Sarah during our counseling sessions, She explained that effective grief support required understanding the complete context of participants' lives and circumstances. The program conducted background assessments to ensure that support recommendations were appropriate for each individual's specific situation. She assured me that all information was handled confidentially and used only to provide better therapeutic support. The comprehensive background research allowed counselors to understand factors that might be affecting grief recovery, such as financial stress or family dynamics. Around the 6th week of my participation in the program, Sarah began requesting that I help with outreach activities for other people who might benefit from their grief support services. These assignments involved identifying and contacting people in my local area who had recently experienced losses and might need professional support. The outreach work was presented as a therapeutic activity that would help with my own grief recovery by allowing me to help others facing similar challenges. Sarah explained that many people found meaning and healing through supporting others who were struggling with loss. I was provided with lists of recently bereaved people in the Reading area, along with detailed information about their circumstances and contact details. The lists included information about causes of death, family situations, and psychological profiles that seemed far too comprehensive for routine outreach activities. When I questioned how the program had obtained such detailed information about vulnerable people, Sarah explained that they worked with various healthcare and social service providers to identify individuals who might benefit from immediate grief support. The detailed profiles ensured that outreach efforts were appropriate and effective. However, the specific types of information I was being asked to gather during outreach contacts seemed designed for purposes beyond therapeutic support. I was documenting people's psychological vulnerabilities, financial circumstances, and social isolation levels in ways that could be valuable for exploitation rather than help. Some of the people I contacted during outreach activities seemed to be in extremely vulnerable situations, dealing with complex grief while managing financial difficulties, family conflicts, or health problems. The information I was gathering would be useful for identifying people who could be manipulated or taken advantage of during their most vulnerable periods. When I tried to refuse the outreach assignments, Sarah reminded me that I had been receiving valuable grief support that would normally cost hundreds of pounds through private healthcare. The program depended on participants contributing to community support activities to maintain the comprehensive services they provided. She also pointed out that I had detailed knowledge of other participants' personal circumstances and access to private support communities that contained sensitive information about vulnerable people. My involvement in the program had created ongoing responsibilities that extended beyond my individual therapy needs. Sarah began demonstrating knowledge of my daily activities and personal circumstances that she couldn't have gathered through our counseling relationship alone. She made references to my financial situation, family interactions, and daily routine that suggested comprehensive surveillance of my personal life. I realized that the grief support program had been used to recruit me into systematic exploitation of vulnerable bereaved people. The counseling sessions had been genuine enough to establish trust and dependency, while the online communities had been used to gather detailed intelligence about people dealing with loss and trauma. The outreach activities were probably designed to identify and assess additional targets for exploitation, using my legitimate grief and desire to help others as cover for intelligence gathering about vulnerable people in my local area. When I attempted to withdraw from the program entirely, Sarah pointed out that I had sensitive information about other participants and access to private support communities that could be harmful if misused. My knowledge of their methods and participant details created ongoing security considerations. She also suggested that ending my therapy abruptly could be detrimental to my grief recovery, particularly given the progress I had been making and my continued vulnerability following Emma's death. The therapeutic relationship was important for my psychological stability and shouldn't be disrupted without careful consideration. The surveillance of my personal activities became more obvious after I tried to end my participation in the program. The monitoring capabilities that had been established through the online support platforms continued to track my communications and activities even after I stopped participating in group sessions. I tried reporting my concerns to healthcare regulatory authorities, but discovered that explaining the situation was extremely difficult. The counseling sessions had been professionally conducted. The online support could be justified as innovative therapy methods, and the outreach activities could be explained as peer support work. Sarah's organization continued to contact me for several months after I stopped participating, offering additional grief support services and occasionally sending references to my personal activities to remind me that their monitoring capabilities remained active. I never determined who was actually directing the support program or what they were using the detailed intelligence about vulnerable, bereaved people for. The systematic exploitation of people's grief and trauma, combined with sophisticated surveillance techniques disguised as therapy platforms, suggested an organization capable of extensive manipulation and fraud. What I understand now is that they had developed effective methods for exploiting people's grief to recruit unwitting participants in intelligence-gathering operations targeting vulnerable, bereaved individuals. They understood how to use legitimate therapeutic relationships to establish trust while using support communities to gather comprehensive personal information about people at their most vulnerable moments. The most disturbing aspect of this experience was how my genuine need for grief support had been transformed into participation in systematic exploitation of other people dealing with similar losses. The support program had been designed to identify and recruit people whose emotional vulnerabilities could be leveraged for criminal purposes. I still receive occasional contact attempts from similar grief support organizations, offering immediate access to counseling and peer support communities for people dealing with loss and trauma. The services they describe always offer enhanced privacy through specialized platforms, always involve comprehensive background assessment, and always include peer outreach components. I decline these opportunities immediately now, but I wonder how many other grieving people have found themselves in similar situations, believing they are receiving legitimate therapeutic support while actually participating in intelligence-gathering operations that exploit the vulnerability of bereaved individuals for criminal purposes. Look, I'm going to be completely honest with you about what happened, because keeping it to myself isn't working anymore. I keep seeing their faces everywhere I go now, and I think you deserve to know what you might be walking into if you're not careful about your daily routines. It all kicked off when I spotted this detailed map of my walking route stuck to the community notice board outside Sainsbury's. Someone had been timing my movements down to the minute. I wish I'd just torn it down and forgotten about it, but I've always been too curious for my own good. The map appeared on the notice board outside Sainsbury's in Headington, where I do my weekly shop every Saturday morning. It was tucked between advertisements for piano lessons and lost cat appeals, drawn on ordinary A4 paper, but with an attention to detail that made my stomach turn. Every street I walk down, every shortcut I take, every place I stop to check my phone, all of it documented with timestamps that were accurate to within minutes. My daily routine isn't particularly interesting. I work from home as a freelance copy editor, so most days I only leave the house for a walk around Headington and South Park during my lunch break. It's the same route every day, starting from my flat on Osler Road and following a roughly circular path that takes about 40 minutes. I'd assumed it was such an unremarkable routine that nobody would notice or care about my movements. But someone had been paying very close attention indeed. The map showed not just my walking route, but also my behavioral patterns. Notes about which side of the street I prefer, where I usually stop to rest, even which benches I sit on when I need to take a break. There were observations about my clothing choices, the bag I carry, and the times when I deviate from my standard route. Most disturbing were the personal details scribbled in the margins. My approximate age, my living situation, notes about my apparent health and fitness level. Someone had been close enough to observe and document intimate details about my daily life, yet I'd never noticed anyone paying particular attention to my movements. I took the map down from the notice board immediately, but not before photographing it with my phone. Looking at it more carefully at home, I realized the handwriting included additional information that was even more unsettling. There were references to my work schedule, my weekend habits, even speculation about my social relationships and living arrangements. The level of surveillance suggested someone had been observing me for months, not weeks. They knew my routines well enough to predict my movements and had gathered enough personal information to build a comprehensive profile of my daily life. But why would anyone go to such lengths to monitor a freelance copy editor who lives alone and maintains a predictably boring routine? I spent the weekend trying to identify who might have been watching me, retracing my walking route and looking for vantage points where someone could observe without being noticed. There were several possibilities: windows in nearby houses, secluded spots in the park, even parked cars that might provide cover for surveillance. What I discovered was more disturbing than obvious watching posts. Several of the houses along my route had small cameras positioned to capture street activity. Not obvious security cameras, but subtle devices that could easily be mistaken for doorbells or decorative fixtures. Some were positioned at exactly the right angles to monitor the specific areas where I'd been documented stopping or resting. I started paying attention to other details I'd previously ignored. Cars that seemed to appear regularly during my walks, people who were often present at particular locations, even dogs that were walked at consistent times that coincided with my routine. What emerged was a picture of coordinated observation that involved multiple people and strategic positioning of surveillance equipment. This wasn't casual stalking by an individual with an unhealthy interest. It was systematic monitoring that suggested a more organized purpose. I tried to research similar cases online, looking for information about surveillance networks and organized stalking. Most of what I found was either obviously paranoid conspiracy theories or legitimate security advice that didn't match the sophisticated nature of what I'd experienced. But following various links and references led me into online communities where people discussed more unusual forms of surveillance and personal monitoring. Some of these communities operated through private channels that required special access methods to reach. Eventually, I found myself exploring parts of the internet that exist beyond normal search engines and standard websites. What I discovered was a marketplace where detailed surveillance information about ordinary people was being bought and sold. The platforms I accessed were carefully organized with different sections for various types of personal intelligence. There were categories for daily routines, work schedules, social relationships, health information, and financial circumstances. Each category contained detailed profiles of individuals who had been systematically monitored and documented. My own information was there, listed under a section called Low-Risk Targets, with a comprehensive file that included not just my walking routes, but photographs taken during my daily activities, detailed notes about my behavior patterns, and speculation about my personal circumstances. The file had been compiled over several months and included information I didn't even know about myself. Things like which days I seemed tired or stressed, how I reacted to different weather conditions, even patterns in my clothing choices that suggested my mood or health status. But most disturbing was the purpose of this surveillance network. The platform wasn't just collecting information. It was offering services to buyers who wanted access to specific individuals. Clients could commission detailed surveillance reports on particular targets, or they could browse existing profiles and select subjects who met their requirements. The services offered range from basic background research to what they called environmental access coordination. This included gaining entry to targets' homes during predictable absence periods, installing monitoring equipment, and conducting what they described as proximity engagement with subjects who remained unaware they were being observed. My profile had been marked as available for enhanced monitoring, with a note that my predictable routine and isolated living situation made me suitable for direct intervention services if required by potential clients. I was being offered as a product to anonymous buyers who could pay for increasingly invasive access to my private life. The pricing structure was sophisticated, with different rates for various types of access and interaction. Basic surveillance reports cost a few £100s, while residential access coordination was priced in the thousands. The most expensive service was something called subject acquisition, which carried a price tag that suggested it involved more than simple monitoring. Reading through client testimonials and service reviews, I began to understand the full scope of what was happening. Some buyers were using the surveillance information for traditional criminal purposes, identifying optimal times for burglary, gathering data for identity theft, or planning more serious crimes that required detailed knowledge of their targets' routines. But others had motivations that were more psychological than financial. They seemed to derive satisfaction from knowing intimate details about strangers' lives, from watching people who remained unaware they were being observed. The surveillance wasn't a means to an end, it was the end itself. There were discussions about clients who used the gathered intelligence for what they called lifestyle integration, gradually inserting themselves into their targets' daily routines through carefully planned coincidental encounters. They would position themselves along walking routes, frequent the same shops and cafes, even move into nearby properties to maintain closer observation. The goal seemed to be creating artificial relationships based on comprehensive prior knowledge of their target's interests, vulnerabilities, and daily habits. They could appear to be perfect matches for friendship or romance because they already knew everything about the people they were targeting. I thought about my own walking route and the coordinated surveillance that had been used to document my movements. Someone had paid for comprehensive monitoring of my daily life, and now they had enough information to predict my behavior and engineer meetings that would seem natural, but were actually carefully orchestrated encounters. But I also realized that the map posted on the community notice board wasn't accidental exposure of their surveillance activities. It was deliberate, a message intended to inform me that I was being watched and to gauge my reaction to that knowledge. They wanted me to know I was being monitored. This suggested that whoever had commissioned surveillance on me was moving to the next phase of whatever they had planned. The initial monitoring period was complete, and now they were testing how I would respond to awareness of their activities. I started paying closer attention to my daily walks, looking for signs of the coordinated observation I now knew was taking place. What I discovered was that the surveillance had intensified rather than decreased since I'd found the map. There were more cameras positioned along my route, more people who seemed to be present at convenient observation points, more vehicles that appeared regularly during my walks. Instead of being deterred by my awareness, they seemed to be escalating their monitoring activities. But there was something else that made the situation more personal and immediate. I started recognizing faces among the people I encountered during my walks. The same individuals appeared repeatedly, always in positions where they could observe my activities without appearing suspicious. Dog walkers who lingered in particular areas, joggers who maintained consistent schedules that coincided with mine, even people waiting at bus stops who never seemed to board any buses. They weren't trying to remain hidden anymore. They wanted me to notice them, to understand that I was surrounded by people who were watching and documenting my every movement. The psychological pressure was more effective than any obvious threat. Knowing that every step I took was being observed and recorded, that my daily routine was being analyzed and shared with anonymous buyers, created a level of paranoia that made normal activities feel dangerous. I considered changing my routine, avoiding the walking route that had been so thoroughly documented, but I realized that would only confirm their influence over my behavior. They would simply adapt their surveillance methods to whatever new patterns I established. Worse still, I began to suspect that some of the people I encountered regularly during my walks weren't just observers. They were potential clients who had purchased access to my surveillance information and were using it to engineer encounters that seemed coincidental. The friendly woman, who often walked her dog in the park, had started conversations that demonstrated surprising knowledge about my interests and daily schedule. The man who jogged past me at roughly the same time each day had begun acknowledging me with increasingly familiar greetings that suggested he knew more about me than casual observation would provide. Even shopkeepers and cafe staff seemed unusually interested in my routine, asking questions about my work schedule and weekend plans that felt more invasive than polite conversation. I was surrounded by people who knew intimate details about my life, while I remained ignorant of their true motivations for engaging with me. The situation reached a turning point when I discovered that my flat had been accessed while I was out on my daily walk. Nothing was obviously stolen or disturbed, but there were subtle signs that someone had been inside. Items moved slightly from their usual positions. Doors left ajar that I always kept closed. Even the arrangement of papers on my desk altered in ways that suggested that they'd been examined and replaced. But most disturbing was finding additional surveillance equipment that had been installed while I was away. Small cameras had been positioned in locations where they could monitor my daily activities inside the flat. Not obvious devices, but subtle modifications to existing fixtures that would be virtually undetectable unless you knew what to look for. They had escalated from external surveillance to complete invasion of my private space. I spent the evening identifying and removing the monitoring equipment, but I knew this was only a temporary solution. If they could gain access to my flat once, they could do it again whenever my predictable routine provided the opportunity. More troubling was the realization that they had probably been monitoring my online activities as well, which explained how they'd known I'd discovered their marketplace and understood the extent of their surveillance network. They were watching my research into their operations, monitoring my attempts to understand what was happening to me, possibly even anticipating my next moves based on the information I'd been accessing. That night, I found a message waiting for me when I returned from my walk. It had been slipped under my door while I was out, despite the fact that my building requires keycard access and my flat is on the 3rd floor. The message was handwritten on plain paper, with the same precise penmanship I'd seen on the surveillance map. The note was brief and matter-of-fact in tone. It simply stated that my research into their community had been noted with interest, and that my technical skills and attention to detail suggested I might be suitable for recruitment as a surveillance operative myself. They were offering me a position within their network, conducting monitoring operations on other targets in exchange for payment and protection from further surveillance of my own activities. The alternative, they suggested, would be escalation to what they called direct engagement protocols, which would involve more invasive monitoring and closer personal contact with clients who had expressed interest in my profile. I was being given a choice between becoming a participant in their surveillance network or becoming a more intensive target of their monitoring activities. But I knew this wasn't really a choice at all. They had demonstrated their ability to access my home, monitor my activities, and coordinate complex surveillance operations involving multiple people and sophisticated equipment. Refusing their recruitment offer would simply confirm that I posed a threat to their operations. The message included instructions for accessing a private section of their marketplace, where I could review current surveillance assignments and begin training in their monitoring techniques. I've been staring at those instructions for the past 3 hours, trying to decide whether cooperation or resistance offers any realistic hope of escape from their network. But I think the decision has already been made for me. Through my window, I can see at least 6 people positioned at various observation points around my building. They're making no attempt to remain hidden, clearly demonstrating that I'm completely surrounded by their surveillance network. My phone has been receiving text messages with updates about my activities inside the flat, proving that they're monitoring my movements in real time despite my removal of the obvious surveillance equipment they'd installed. And there are sounds from the hallway outside my flat that suggest someone is preparing to gain access again, probably to install more sophisticated monitoring equipment that I won't be able to detect or remove. I think I'm about to discover what direct engagement protocols actually involve, and why they were so confident that recruitment was my only viable option. The sounds outside my door have stopped, but I can see shadows moving under the door frame that suggest at least 2 people are positioned directly outside. They're not trying to break in, they're just waiting, demonstrating their ability to access my building and position themselves wherever they choose. The message is clear. I can join their surveillance network voluntarily, or they'll continue escalating their monitoring activities until cooperation becomes my only option for maintaining any semblance of normal life. I'm opening my laptop now to access the instructions they provided, not because I want to become part of their surveillance network, but because I've finally understood that resistance will only result in more invasive monitoring and closer personal contact with the clients who've been purchasing access to my private life. Sometimes cooperation is the only form of survival available. Imagine discovering that your teenage daughter knows more about the darkest corners of the internet than you could ever comprehend, and that her knowledge isn't theoretical. I teach journalism at Leeds University, specializing in digital media ethics. It's the sort of academic position that sounds more exciting than it actually is, mostly grading essays about social media responsibility and explaining libel law to students who think Twitter is a primary source. My expertise extends to understanding how information spreads online, but I'd never ventured beyond the surface web until my daughter forced my hand. Emma came home from sixth form last autumn with what she called a special project. She'd convinced her media studies teacher to let her write about online anonymity and digital crime for her A-level coursework. The teacher had approved it, thinking she'd write about cyberbullying or identity theft. the usual teenage internet horror stories. Emma had something much more ambitious in mind. She asked me to help her access what she called the hidden internet. She knew I'd written academic papers about digital journalism and assumed I'd have the technical knowledge to guide her research. The truth was, I understood the theory, but had never actually explored these networks myself. Still, she was my daughter, and this was legitimate academic work. How dangerous could supervised research really be? We spent an evening setting up the necessary software on her laptop. Emma was surprisingly well informed about the process, mentioning specific browsers and security protocols that I had to look up as we went along. She claimed to have learned everything from YouTube tutorials and online forums, but her knowledge seemed more comprehensive than casual research would explain. Her project proposal was methodical and well structured. She wanted to document how illegal marketplaces operated, how anonymity was maintained, and how law enforcement attempted to monitor these activities. She planned to observe and document, not participate. It seemed like exactly the sort of investigative work that would impress university admissions committees. The first few weeks went smoothly. Emma would spend a couple of hours each evening browsing various sites, taking screenshots, and making notes about what she observed. She showed me drug marketplaces, weapon sales, and document forgery services. Everything was exactly what I'd expected. Seedy, obviously illegal, but ultimately just digital storefronts for familiar crimes. She was particularly interested in how these sites built trust between anonymous users. She documented reputation systems, escrow services, and community guidelines that governed illegal transactions. Her analysis was sophisticated, noting how these platforms replicated legitimate e-commerce features while operating completely outside legal frameworks. Then she discovered the entertainment sections. Emma mentioned them casually during one of our research sessions, describing live streaming services that offered what she called extreme content. She was vague about specifics, focusing instead on the technical aspects: how payments were processed, how viewers were verified, how streams were protected from outside monitoring. I should have been more curious about her evasiveness. Emma had been remarkably detailed about everything else she'd encountered, but when discussing these streaming services, she became almost professionally distant. She spoke about them like a researcher cataloging specimens, not a teenager encountering disturbing material for the first time. Her coursework notes from this period show a troubling shift in focus. Instead of broadly documenting illegal activities, she began concentrating specifically on what she termed interactive entertainment platforms. Her research became more targeted, more technical, and considerably more secretive. She stopped showing me her daily findings, claiming she needed to organize her material before sharing it. When I asked direct questions about what she was discovering, she'd deflect by discussing technical challenges or asking about legal frameworks surrounding digital evidence collection. Around Christmas, Emma's behavior started changing in subtle ways. She became more withdrawn, spending longer periods alone in her room. She'd always been somewhat solitary, but now she seemed actively to avoid family interaction. When she did engage in conversation, she seemed distracted, as though part of her attention was always elsewhere. Her sleep patterns shifted dramatically. I'd hear her moving around the house at 2 or 3 in the morning, using the kitchen or bathroom with the careful quietness of someone trying not to wake others. When I mentioned this, she claimed to be working on her project during late-night hours when internet connections were more stable. In January, she asked me about legal protections for journalists and researchers. Specifically, she wanted to know about circumstances where witnessing illegal activity might require reporting to authorities, and what protections existed for academic research that involved observing criminal behavior. I explained the general principles. Journalists had some protections for source confidentiality, but no absolute immunity from reporting serious crimes. Researchers were expected to maintain ethical boundaries and weren't protected from prosecution if they participated in illegal activities rather than simply observing them. Emma listened carefully and asked several follow-up questions about where exactly the line existed between observation and participation. She seemed particularly interested in scenarios where researchers might influence events they were supposedly just documenting. Her questions made me uncomfortable, but I assumed they were theoretical concerns for her coursework. I encouraged her to discuss any ethical dilemmas with her teacher or the University Ethics Board if she was considering more advanced research. February brought the first real warning sign that something was seriously wrong. Emma received a package addressed to her personally, delivered by private courier rather than regular post. When I asked about it, she claimed it was research material she'd ordered online. The package was small, roughly the size of a smartphone box, but she handled it with unusual care and took it directly to her room. Later that day, I noticed she'd rearranged her bedroom setup. Her laptop was now positioned differently, with what looked like additional equipment connected to it. When I asked about the new hardware, she explained that she needed better audio recording capabilities for her project. The equipment didn't look like standard recording gear. There were small cameras, additional monitors, and what appeared to be professional-grade lighting equipment. For a project that was supposed to involve observing existing content, she seemed to be setting up for content creation. Around the same time, Emma began receiving phone calls from unknown numbers. She'd always answer them privately, usually taking the calls outside or in her room with the door closed. The conversations were brief, and she never volunteered information about who was calling or why. When I asked directly, she claimed they were interviews with academic contacts she'd found. Through her research, she said she was speaking with digital rights activists and cybersecurity researchers who preferred telephone communication for security reasons. The explanation was plausible enough, but something about her demeanor during these calls troubled me. She seemed nervous rather than excited, as though the conversations were stressful rather than informative. In March, Emma asked for help accessing university library databases that required staff credentials. She needed academic papers about legal precedents for digital evidence and international jurisdiction issues surrounding online crimes. The research she was requesting seemed far beyond A-level requirements. She was looking for case studies involving cross-border prosecution of internet crimes, specific technical details about how digital evidence was collected and verified, and legal analysis of situations where criminal activity was documented by civilians. I helped her access the databases, but I began reviewing the papers she was downloading. The material was genuinely academic, but it painted a disturbing picture of her research interests. She was clearly preparing for scenarios that went far beyond passive observation of illegal activities. One evening in early April, while Emma was out, I decided to examine her laptop more closely. I know this violated her privacy, but her behavior had become concerning enough that I felt parental supervision was warranted. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Her browser history showed dozens of visits to sites I'd never heard of, with names that suggested extremely disturbing content. But more troubling were the accounts she'd created on various platforms, accounts with usernames and profile information that suggested she wasn't just observing these communities. She'd been actively participating in discussions about what appeared to be live-streamed violence. Her posts showed detailed knowledge of how these streams operated, who organized them, and how viewers could influence what happened during broadcasts. Most disturbing were her private messages with other users. The conversations suggested she'd moved beyond research and begun actively engaging with people who organized and participated in these activities. Some messages included references to meeting in person and participating in what they called production activities. The timeline of these communications showed a clear progression from curious observer to active participant over the course of several months. By the most recent messages, Emma was discussing specific dates, locations, and her potential role in upcoming events. I sat in her room for nearly an hour, reading through months of communications that revealed my daughter had become involved in something far more serious than academic research. The technical equipment in her room wasn't for recording observations, it was for broadcasting content. When Emma returned home that evening, I was waiting in the kitchen with printouts of her most concerning communications. I decided that direct confrontation was the only option remaining. Her reaction was not what I'd expected. Instead of denial or defensiveness, Emma seemed almost relieved that I'd discovered her activities. She sat down across from me and calmly began explaining what she'd been doing for the past several months. She confirmed that her project had begun as legitimate research, but she'd been recruited by people who recognized her intelligence and academic approach to understanding their operations. They'd offered her opportunities to move from observer to participant, initially in minor technical roles. Emma described how she'd been gradually introduced to more serious activities, always with the assurance that her involvement was minimal and primarily technical. She'd been told that her academic background made her valuable for documentation and analysis, rather than direct participation in what she carefully termed the entertainment aspects. She explained that the equipment in her room was for quality control and technical support, rather than primary content creation. Her role was to monitor streams, manage viewer interactions, and ensure technical problems were resolved quickly. Emma spoke about all of this with disturbing matter-of-factness, as though she were describing a part-time job, rather than participation in serious criminal activity. She seemed to view her involvement as a natural progression from research to practical application of her knowledge. What made her explanation most chilling was her obvious intelligence and careful consideration of legal and ethical implications. This wasn't a naive teenager being manipulated by criminals. This was someone who understood exactly what she was involved in and had made calculated decisions about her level of participation. She'd researched legal precedents, understood jurisdiction issues, and carefully structured her involvement to minimize personal risk while maintaining plausible deniability. Her academic approach to criminal activity was more disturbing than simple recklessness would have been. Emma finished her explanation by noting that she'd been expecting this conversation for several weeks. She'd known her activities would eventually be discovered and had prepared responses to the questions she anticipated I'd ask. She had plans for managing the situation, including strategies for ending her involvement if necessary, and methods for ensuring that any evidence of her participation would be difficult to verify or prosecute. We sat in the kitchen until nearly 3 a.m, discussing her involvement in activities I could barely comprehend. Emma answered my questions with clinical precision, explaining technical details and legal considerations with the expertise of someone who'd spent months studying every aspect of what she was doing. By the end of our conversation, I understood that my daughter had become someone I didn't recognize. The intelligent, methodical approach that had always made me proud of her had been applied to activities that horrified me. Emma went to bed that night with the promise that we'd continue our discussion the following evening. She seemed confident that she could convince me her involvement was manageable, and that the risks were acceptable given the financial and educational benefits she was receiving. I stayed awake until dawn, trying to decide what options were available to me. Calling the police would certainly end Emma's involvement, but it would also destroy her future and potentially put her in physical danger from people who trusted her with sensitive information. Attempting to force her to stop might simply drive her activities underground, making them more dangerous and removing any possibility of monitoring or influencing her choices. The most disturbing realization was that Emma was probably right about the legal risks. Her involvement had been carefully structured to avoid direct participation in the most serious crimes, and her academic credentials provided plausible explanations for much of her knowledge and activity. 3 days later, Emma left for what she claimed was a university visit in Birmingham. She took the train on Friday morning, planning to return Sunday evening after attending information sessions and campus tours. She never came back. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. Her social media accounts were deactivated the day she left. The university she claimed to be visiting has no record of her registration for any information sessions. The equipment in her room is gone, along with her laptop and most of her personal belongings. She left behind only her school textbooks and a note saying she'd contact me when it was safe to do so. It's been 8 months since Emma disappeared. I've reported her missing, but without evidence of foul play. The police investigation has been minimal. A 17-year-old who left voluntarily with her own belongings and documentation isn't considered high priority. I've tried to trace her digital activities, but the accounts and platforms I discovered have either been deleted or require technical access I don't possess. The academic research that started everything is still on our home computer, but it reveals nothing about where she might have gone or who she might be with. Sometimes I receive text messages from unknown numbers with just a few words confirming that she's safe. The messages come from different locations around the country, never the same number twice, always brief enough to avoid meaningful conversation. I know Emma is alive and apparently unharmed, but I don't know what she's become or whether I'll ever see her again. The intelligent, methodical daughter I raised has disappeared into a world I helped her access, using skills I encouraged her to develop. The worst part is knowing that everything she did was logical and well planned. Emma didn't stumble into danger through poor judgment or teenage impulsivity. She made careful, calculated decisions that led her away from everything I thought we'd built together. Her A-level coursework is still in her room. 90 pages of detailed analysis about digital crime and online anonymity. It's brilliant work, demonstrating exactly the sort of critical thinking and research capability that should have led to university admission and a successful academic career. Instead, it reads like a manual for everything that happened afterward. It takes a lot to get under my skin. Always has, even as a kid. Horror films, creepy stories around campfires, haunted houses at fun fairs. None of it ever really affected me. My friends used to think I was putting on a brave face. But the truth is, I just didn't find that stuff disturbing. I worked as a paramedic for 3 years in Manchester before switching to IT. So I've seen my share of real-life horror. Fictional scares just don't compare. But what happened last spring? Well, that's different. That's why I'm finally writing this down after months of sleepless nights. It started with a perfectly ordinary problem. My laptop, a hand-me-down from my older brother when he upgraded, was running slower than usual. Nothing dramatic, just the typical issues with an aging machine. Programs taking ages to load, videos stuttering, that maddening spinning wheel that never seems to stop. I'm relatively tech-savvy, enough to handle basic troubleshooting, but this was beyond the usual turning it off and on again fix. My brother had used it for graphic design work, so it was cluttered with programs and files I didn't need, but had been too lazy to clean up properly. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that evening, the overhead light casting harsh shadows and highlighting the coffee stains on the wooden surface. My flatmate was out for the night, some birthday drinks with colleagues, so the flat had that particular emptiness that makes ordinary sounds seem louder. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing outside, the clicking of my laptop's overworked fan trying desperately to cool down the processor. I decided to look for some free system optimization tools online. Nothing fancy, just something to clean up unnecessary files and maybe speed things up a bit. I should mention that I was on a fairly tight budget at the time. I'd just been made redundant from my tech support job. The company outsourced our entire department with barely 2 weeks' notice and was picking up freelance work while job hunting. Every penny counted, which is why I was trying to squeeze more life out of this laptop rather than replacing it. After some searching, I found a forum where people were discussing various optimization tools. One user had posted a link to what they described as a comprehensive toolkit that included several different programs bundled together: system cleaner, registry repair, driver updater, the works. It sounded exactly what I needed, and several other users had commented positively about it. I remember hesitating briefly. Free software bundles can be dodgy, but my frugal side won out. I clicked the link and started the download. While I waited, I made myself a cup of tea, absent-mindedly stirring in too much sugar as I scrolled through job listings on my phone. The wind had picked up outside, making the windows rattle slightly in their frames. Our flat was in an old Victorian conversion, full of character and drafts in equal measure. I pulled my hoodie sleeves over my hands, a habit from childhood that I'd never quite shaken. The download finished just as I was taking my first sip of tea, too hot, burning the tip of my tongue, in that way that you know will annoy you for days. The installation process was straightforward enough. I clicked through the usual prompts, half reading the terms and conditions like most people do. In hindsight, I should have been more careful, more thorough. Maybe I would have noticed something. But then again, maybe not. Some dangers aren't clearly signposted. Once installed, the software opened to a simple dashboard showing various tools and options. I ran a system scan, which identified a surprising amount of junk files and registry issues. As it worked, I noticed my desktop now had several new shortcuts, typical for these kinds of bundles, which often install additional programs whether you want them or not. Most were labeled clearly registry cleaner, driver update, system monitor. But there was one that caught my eye because it seemed out of place. Just a simple icon labeled DNet Access. I hovered over it, trying to remember if I'd seen it during the installation process. The cursor seemed to lag slightly, which I attributed to the system scan running in the background. Curious, I double-clicked it. A small plain window opened with a loading bar and no other information. I waited, assuming it was some network diagnostic tool. After a few moments, the window changed to what looked like a login screen, but not for any service I recognized. The interface was minimalist, almost crude. Black background with simple white text, no graphics or branding. It requested a username and password, with a note below stating, "Guest access available." There was something oddly dated about the design. reminiscent of early internet pages before sleek interfaces became standard. I didn't have login credentials, obviously, so I clicked the guest access option. The screen changed again, this time showing what appeared to be a directory listing. Just file and folder names, no icons or preview options. The names were mostly strings of numbers and letters that meant nothing to me. I scrolled through, wondering what kind of program this was and why it had been bundled with system optimization tools. I noticed my tea had gone cold. The radiator beneath the window was making that knocking sound it always did when it first heated up, and I pulled my sleeves down again against the chill. Outside, the streetlights had come on, casting an orange glow through the thin curtains. I checked the time, just past 9, but it felt later somehow. As I scrolled through the directory, one folder caught my attention. Live streams. That seemed relatively normal compared to the cryptic names surrounding it. Thinking it might be some kind of media player or streaming service, I clicked it. The folder expanded to show several subfolders labeled by date. They followed a pattern of year, month, day, and the most recent was from that very day. Curiosity got the better of me, my greatest fault, according to my mother, and I clicked on that day's folder. Inside were more folders, these labeled with timestamps. Again, I selected the most recent, which had been created just minutes earlier. The application suddenly switched to what appeared to be a video player. The screen was black momentarily, then flickered to life, showing what looked like a clinical setting. White walls, bright overhead lighting, stainless steel surfaces. My first thought was that I'd somehow accessed some kind of medical education platform, perhaps left over from my brother's university days. He'd studied biomedical science before switching to graphic design, and I wondered if this was some archived lecture or demonstration. The camera angle changed, revealing more of the room. It resembled an operating theatre, but something wasn't quite right. It lacked the organized professional appearance of a hospital setting. The equipment looked medical, but was arranged haphazardly. And there was a person, a man, I think, lying on what appeared to be a modified examination table. He wasn't moving, but I could see his chest rising and falling rapidly. There was a sinking feeling in my stomach then, a primal recognition that something was deeply wrong before my conscious mind had fully processed what I was seeing. I remember my fingers hovering over the trackpad, caught between the instinct to close the window immediately and a horrified paralysis that kept my eyes fixed on the screen. A figure moved into frame, wearing what looked like surgical scrubs and a mask. But again, not quite right. The mask wasn't medical standard, more like something you'd buy at a costume shop. They were pulling on latex gloves with deliberate, almost theatrical slowness. A chat window I hadn't noticed before was active on the right side of the screen, with messages scrolling by too quickly to read properly. My brain was desperately trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe this was some kind of extreme performance art. Maybe a very realistic horror film being streamed. Maybe a simulation for medical or psychology students. Then the masked figure turned toward the camera and made a gesture that seemed like a greeting or acknowledgement. They moved to a small table beside them and picked up what appeared to be a scalpel. The chat window exploded with activity. I caught fragments of messages as they scrolled by, people expressing excitement, making requests, offering payment. With growing horror, I realized that the viewers weren't just watching this for educational purposes or even for some twisted entertainment. They were directing it, participating. The figure approached the table where the person lay. I could now see that the person was restrained, wrists, ankles, forehead bound with what looked like leather straps. They were conscious, eyes darting frantically, chest heaving with rapid breaths. There was no audio, but I could see their mouth moving behind some kind of gag. I felt physically ill. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage to move the cursor. I closed the window, then frantically looked for a way to uninstall the entire software bundle. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd seen, while simultaneously trying to convince myself it wasn't real. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't acted. This wasn't simulated. The terror in that person's eyes was genuine. I was witnessing something happening in real time, something unspeakable. I managed to uninstall the software, my hands still trembling, sweat beading on my forehead despite the chill in the room. I ran a virus scan immediately afterward, then another with different software. I deleted the original installation file and emptied my recycle bin. I cleared my browser history and cache, though I hadn't used the browser to access whatever that was. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that clinical room, that masked figure, those terrified eyes. I kept telling myself to report it, but to who? And what exactly would I say? That I'd accidentally stumbled upon what appeared to be a live stream of torture, or worse, through some random software I'd downloaded. How would I explain that without sounding complicit somehow? And even if I did report it, what information could I actually provide that would help identify the location or the people involved? The next morning, I convinced myself that I needed more information before going to the authorities. I needed to understand what I'd found and gather some kind of evidence. It was a rationalization. I know that now. Part of me was morbidly curious, wanting confirmation that what I'd seen was real before, potentially making a fool of myself by reporting it. I created a virtual machine on my laptop, an isolated environment that wouldn't affect my main system, and reinstalled the software bundle. The DNet access shortcut appeared again. This time, I was more methodical, more careful. I took screenshots of everything, documented the directory structure, noted the timestamps. I didn't click on any live stream links, focusing instead on trying to gather information about what this service was and who was behind it. I discovered that DNet apparently stood for Dissection Network. There were archived files going back years, all organized by date and type of procedure. Reading the descriptions made me physically sick. I had to rush to the bathroom twice to vomit. This wasn't just some dark corner of the internet. It was an organized service catering to people with the most disturbing desires imaginable, allowing them not just to watch, but to direct acts of unimaginable cruelty. In a folder labeled Members, I found what appeared to be user profiles, usernames, countries, payment information. There were thousands of them from all over the world. I was documenting everything, planning to take it all to the police, when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My IP address was listed in a file of recent access logs. Next to it was my approximate location based on that IP, the time I'd accessed the stream the previous night, and a status marked Tracked. I shut down the virtual machine immediately and physically disconnected my internet router. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. They knew I had accessed their service. They knew roughly where I was located, and they were tracking me. What followed were the most paranoid weeks of my life. I wiped my laptop completely, then sold it to a second-hand shop 2 towns over. I bought a new one with cash and never connected it to my home network. I stayed with a friend for a few days, making excuses about problems with my flat's heating. I considered going to the police multiple times but was paralyzed by fear, not just of the people behind that site, but also of not being believed or somehow being treated as a suspect myself. Eventually, I did make an anonymous report through an online portal, providing as much detail as I could remember without incriminating myself. I have no idea if anything came of it. I never heard anything on the news about a ring being busted or arrests being made. Sometimes I wonder if my report was even taken seriously, or if it just disappeared into a digital void. It's been 8 months now. I've moved twice since then. I use different coffee shops for internet access, never the same one too often. I've changed my phone number, my email addresses, even the name I use on social media. Probably excessive, but the fear lingers. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear someone trying the lock on my door. Sometimes I notice a car parked outside my flat for too long and find myself taking pictures of the license plate just in case. Most days I manage to convince myself that I'm safe, that they wouldn't bother with someone who stumbled across their site accidentally and only viewed it briefly. I tell myself they have bigger concerns than tracking down every random person who finds them. But then I remember that file with my IP address and that word, tracked. And the fear comes flooding back. I'm writing this not as some creepypasta story or urban legend, but as a warning. The dark web isn't just some mysterious bogeyman that people exaggerate about. There are corners of it where the most depraved acts imaginable aren't just fantasized about, but performed on demand for anyone willing to pay. And sometimes, the entrance to those corners isn't hidden behind sophisticated encryption or secret passwords. Sometimes it's just a shortcut on your desktop that you click without thinking. I've just heard a notification sound from my new laptop. An email has arrived. I haven't given this email address to anyone. The subject line is just a string of numbers. I'm afraid to open it, but more afraid not to. If you're reading this, it means I decided to share my experience. Or perhaps someone else found this document and decided it should be shared. Either way, be careful what you download. Be careful what you click. Some things you can't unsee, and some paths, once you've started down them, you can never fully leave behind. Wait, someone's knocking at my door. It's almost midnight. Nobody I know would visit at this hour without calling first. They're knocking again, harder now. Someone had posted my photograph on a missing person website, complete with fabricated details about when I'd supposedly disappeared and who was looking for me. I only found it because my flatmate Sarah was procrastinating on coursework and randomly searching our names online for entertainment. She'd started with herself, then moved through everyone she knew, including me. Most results were the usual social media profiles and university sports team listings. But then she found something that made her call me over to her laptop immediately. The missing person entry showed a recent photograph of me, not one from social media, but a candid shot that appeared to have been taken without my knowledge while I was walking around Canterbury. The description claimed I'd been missing for 6 days, had last been seen near the university campus, and that my family were desperately worried about my safety. The contact information listed a phone number I'd never seen before and an email address that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Most disturbing was how accurate some details were. My age, general appearance description, even the clothes I'd been wearing in the photograph. But other information was completely fabricated, including claims about my mental health and suggestions that I might be in danger. The website itself looked legitimate, with proper layout and other genuine missing person cases listed alongside what was obviously a fake entry about me. It wasn't immediately obvious how someone could have added false information to what appeared to be an official platform for reporting disappeared individuals. Sarah helped me take screenshots of everything before I tried to contact the website administrators to report the fraudulent listing. The contact process required submitting detailed forms with identification documents and explanations of why the entry should be removed, bureaucratic procedures that would take time even for someone trying to correct obvious misinformation about themselves. While we were documenting the fake missing person report, Sarah discovered that the same photograph of me had been used on other platforms as well. Dating websites where someone had created profiles using my picture, classified advertisements for services I'd never offered, even academic research participant databases, where my details had been listed as someone willing to take part in psychological studies. The pattern suggested systematic identity theft rather than a simple prank or mistake. Someone had been using my photograph and personal information to create false identities across multiple platforms for purposes that weren't immediately clear but were clearly unauthorized. When I tried to reverse search the photograph to understand where it had originally come from, I found references to hidden websites that required specific access methods to view. Following these links led me to platforms that specialized in trading personal information and photographs of people who had no idea their details were being distributed. The marketplaces contained thousands of profiles with photographs and personal details of ordinary people, students, young professionals, anyone whose social media presence or public activities had made them visible enough to be documented and catalogued by people who collected such information. Most disturbing was that many profiles included detailed behavioral information alongside the photographs, daily routines, social connections, even psychological assessments based on observed activities and online presence. The kind of comprehensive intelligence that would be valuable for stalking, harassment, or more serious criminal targeting. I realized that my photograph and information weren't just being used for fake dating profiles or fraudulent missing person reports. They were part of a larger database that criminals use to create false identities, plan targeted attacks, or recruit people for various illegal activities. The fake missing person listing might have been designed to establish credibility for someone impersonating me, or to create confusion if I ever did actually go missing. Having an existing missing person report would make it easier for criminals to explain my absence or redirect attention away from their activities. But understanding what was happening didn't provide any immediate way to protect myself or remove my information from these criminal databases. The platforms operated through hidden websites that were difficult to access and impossible to regulate through normal complaint procedures. Meanwhile, people using my stolen identity could be committing fraud, harassment, or other crimes that might eventually be traced back to me, even though I hadn't consented to any of these activities. Explaining that my identity had been stolen would be complicated if law enforcement discovered evidence of criminal activities connected to my personal details. The investigation into my stolen identity also revealed how easily personal information could be gathered about anyone who maintained normal social media presence or participated in university activities. Photographs from public events, details from course listings, even behavioral patterns observable through routine activities provided enough material for comprehensive identity theft. People who thought they were maintaining reasonable privacy were actually providing criminals with everything needed to impersonate them or use their identities for illegal purposes. The information was collected systematically and organized into databases that could be searched and purchased by anyone willing to pay for access to detailed personal profiles. But the most disturbing discovery was that the fake missing person report was just one element of a much more comprehensive impersonation operation. Someone had been using my identity to establish relationships, apply for services, and participate in activities that I knew nothing about. Bank account applications had been submitted using my details. Employment records had been created showing jobs I'd never held. Even medical records existed claiming treatments and diagnoses that had never occurred. My stolen identity had developed an entire parallel existence that could be used to support various criminal activities. The scope of the identity theft suggested that this wasn't opportunistic fraud, but systematic preparation for long-term criminal operations that required established false identities with comprehensive supporting documentation. I tried to research whether other people had experienced similar comprehensive identity theft and found that it was increasingly common for criminals to develop detailed false identities over months or years before using them for major fraud or other serious crimes. The fake missing person report, dating profiles, and service advertisements were all ways of establishing online presence and credibility for stolen identities that would eventually be used for activities requiring trusted personas and believable background histories. Students and young people were particularly attractive targets because they typically had clean criminal records, limited credit histories, and social media presence that provided extensive material for creating convincing impersonations. But most victims never realized their identities had been stolen until serious crimes had been committed using their personal details, making it difficult to prove innocence or recover from the damage caused by activities they'd never participated in. I started monitoring online platforms for additional uses of my stolen identity, documenting everything I found to build evidence that might be useful if criminal activities were eventually traced back to my personal details. The process revealed an entire criminal economy built around stolen identities, with specialized platforms for trading photographs, personal information, and supporting documentation that could be used to create comprehensive false personas. People whose identities had been stolen were unknowingly providing criminals with everything needed to commit fraud, establish relationships with victims, or participate in illegal activities while maintaining plausible deniability about their true identities. The casual way these platforms operated suggested that identity theft was so common and profitable that it had become a routine business model for criminals who understood how to exploit personal information that people shared through normal social and academic activities. But reporting what I'd discovered would require admitting that I'd been browsing illegal websites and potentially accessing criminal platforms, making me appear potentially complicit in activities I was actually trying to investigate and prevent. The stolen identity operation was probably continuing to expand, with my personal details being used for increasingly serious criminal activities, while I remained helpless to prevent the misuse of information that had been gathered without my knowledge or consent. When the police knocked on my door on Tuesday morning, I already knew it couldn't be good news. They were investigating fraud cases where someone using my identity had been targeting elderly victims across England, using the comprehensive background documentation that had been developed through systematic identity theft to establish trust with vulnerable people who had no reason to suspect they were being deceived. I should probably start by saying that I didn't end up in this freezing bedsit by accident. I've been wearing 2 jumpers most evenings just to take the edge off the cold, sitting here in this cramped little room, while I tried to make sense of how things went the way they did. I had a proper flat in Norwich not long ago, decent heating, a bit of space, a view over the park. But I walked away from all of that once I realized what I'd actually been part of these past 8 months. Most nights now, I sit with my laptop balanced on my knees, not typing, just staring at the screen, as I think back over the messages I read and the content I reviewed, all the tiny decisions I made without really understanding who was watching. I used to tell people I worked in content moderation, the harmless kind that keeps things neat and polite. Then I lost that job when the company replaced half of us with automation, and I took on something else that paid far better for what sounded like the same sort of work. It wasn't. And that's the story I'm trying to tell here. How a job I thought I understood ended with me hiding out in a cold room, wondering if the people behind it are going to come looking. I'd been moderating content for a social media platform for about 4 years, before the company decided artificial intelligence could do most of what I did for a fraction of the cost. One day I was reviewing flagged posts and comments. The next I was being told my position was being eliminated, along with 60% of the moderation team. I was 39 years old with a very specific skill set that turned out to be increasingly obsolete. The redundancy package was adequate but not generous, and I spent the better part of 2 months applying for similar roles. Most companies were moving toward automation or outsourcing to countries where labor was cheaper. The few positions I found wanted people with technical qualifications I didn't possess. That's when I saw the job posting on a remote work website. Someone was looking for experienced content moderators to help manage discussion spaces on privacy-focused platforms. The pay was exceptional, nearly £3,000 per month for what they estimated would be about 30 hours of work per week. They emphasized that they needed people who could work independently, make consistent judgment calls, and maintain strict confidentiality about the platforms they'd be moderating. I should have questioned why anyone would pay such generous rates for content moderation work when most companies were desperately trying to reduce those costs. Should have wondered what kind of privacy-focused platforms needed human moderators rather than automated systems. But I was getting desperate, watching my savings diminish while I sent out application after application with no responses. The application process was straightforward. I submitted my CV along with examples of moderation decisions I'd made in my previous role, explaining my reasoning and approach to balancing free expression with community safety. Within 2 days, I had a response requesting a video interview. The interviewer called himself David, though I suspected that wasn't his real name. He explained that their platforms operated in spaces where mainstream social media companies had limited reach, serving communities that valued privacy and unrestricted discussion. They needed moderators who could maintain order without being overly restrictive. People who understood the difference between genuine safety concerns and content that was simply controversial or unpopular. He was careful to emphasize that the work would involve reviewing material that might be disturbing or offensive. The platforms attracted people with unconventional views, and moderators needed to have thick skin and good judgment about what actually constituted a rule violation versus what was just unpleasant but legal expression. That all sounded reasonable to me. I'd spent years reviewing flagged content on mainstream platforms and was accustomed to seeing unpleasant material. I understood that content moderation required balancing competing values, and I was confident in my ability to make consistent judgments based on clear guidelines. David offered me the position at the end of the interview, pending completion of a brief training period where I'd shadow experienced moderators and learn the specific rules and expectations for their platforms. The pay would start immediately, and I'd be working entirely remotely using secure communication systems they'd provide. The training materials arrived via encrypted file transfer, along with login credentials for the platforms I'd be moderating. David explained that the platforms use special browser technology to protect user privacy, which was why they couldn't be accessed through normal internet connections. He provided step-by-step instructions for setting up the necessary software. When I finally accessed the platforms, my first impression was how basic they looked compared to mainstream social media. Simple layouts, minimal graphics, text-based discussions organized into topic categories. The interface reminded me of internet communities from the late 90s, before companies had invested millions in sophisticated user experiences. The content itself was immediately concerning. I'd been expecting controversial political discussions or conspiracy theories, the sort of material that mainstream platforms restricted, but that wasn't necessarily illegal. Instead, I found discussions about topics that were clearly criminal in nature. Detailed guides for exploiting various systems, conversations about targeting specific individuals, even exchanges about coordinating illegal activities. When I raised concerns during my training, the senior moderator explained that their role wasn't to judge the legality or morality of what users discussed. The platforms existed to facilitate free expression in spaces where government surveillance and corporate censorship couldn't reach. Our job was simply to enforce the specific rules the platforms had established, not to act as moral arbiters or law enforcement. The rules themselves were surprisingly specific. No spam or commercial advertising, no revealing personal information about other users without permission, no coordinating attacks against the platforms themselves or their administrators. But almost everything else was permitted, including discussions of criminal activity, as long as they remained theoretical rather than active coordination. I was deeply uncomfortable with the distinction they were drawing, but the senior moderator emphasized that moderators who couldn't maintain professional distance from disturbing content wouldn't last long in the role. This work required accepting that facilitating free expression sometimes meant allowing discussions we personally found abhorrent. I convinced myself this was no different from the principle that defending free speech sometimes means protecting speech we disagree with. I wasn't endorsing what users discussed, just maintaining spaces where they could express themselves without censorship. My role was technical and professional, not moral or legal. The first few weeks of actual moderation work tested that rationalization severely. I reviewed hundreds of flagged posts and comments every day, making decisions about whether they violated the platform's specific rules. Most of the time, the violations were clear: spam, personal information being shared, direct threats against platform administrators. But I was also seeing content that was deeply disturbing. Detailed discussions about exploiting vulnerable people, guides for circumventing security measures and accessing systems without authorization, conversations about targeting specific individuals for harassment or worse, all technically within the platform's rules because they remained theoretical discussions rather than active coordination. I found myself removing spam and commercial advertising while allowing posts that discuss criminal activity in disturbingly specific detail. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, but I kept telling myself I was just following the rules I'd been hired to enforce. I wasn't responsible for what users chose to discuss within those parameters. The breakthrough came about 3 months into the work when I recognized specific details in a discussion thread. Users were discussing a harassment campaign against a teacher in Norfolk, sharing her work address, her daily routine, even photographs of her home and car. The post technically didn't violate platform rules because they weren't coordinating attacks, just sharing information and discussing theoretical approaches. But I recognized the school mentioned in the discussion. It was where my sister's children attended, in a small town outside Kings Lynn. The teacher being discussed was someone I'd met at school events, a kind woman who taught primary school children and had never done anything to warrant the obsessive documentation these users were compiling. I realized I was moderating platforms that facilitated systematic harassment and stalking of real people, including people I knew personally. The theoretical discussions I was allowing weren't abstract debates about controversial topics. They were planning and intelligence gathering for criminal activity against identifiable individuals. I tried reporting the harassment campaign to David, explaining that users were clearly coordinating activity that would result in real harm to a specific person. He thanked me for the report, but explained that unless users explicitly coordinated illegal actions in their posts, the discussions fell within allowed parameters. The platforms existed to facilitate free expression, even when that expression involved sharing information about people who hadn't consented to being discussed. That response made me understand I wasn't moderating online communities to protect users from harm. I was maintaining spaces where people planned and coordinated criminal activity against vulnerable targets. The free expression we were facilitating was actually systematic intelligence gathering and harassment that destroyed real people's lives. I started paying closer attention to the platforms I was moderating, looking beyond individual rule violations to understand the broader context of what users were discussing. What I found was horrifying in its scope and organization. The platforms hosted extensive discussions about identifying vulnerable targets for various types of exploitation. Users shared techniques for surveillance, advice on circumventing security measures, even guides for psychologically manipulating specific types of victims. They coordinated activities without explicitly stating their criminal nature, using coded language and theoretical framing that technically didn't violate platform rules. One category of discussions focused on identifying and exploiting elderly people living alone. Users shared information about specific individuals, photographs of their homes, details about their daily routines. They discussed theoretical approaches for gaining access to properties, theoretical techniques for convincing people to provide financial information or access to their accounts. Another section dealt with targeting children through online spaces. Users shared information about children's social media accounts, their schools, their after-school activities. They discussed theoretical approaches for establishing contact, theoretical techniques for building trust with young people who might be isolated or vulnerable. I was looking at what amounted to criminal planning being conducted in plain sight, shielded by the pretense that these were merely theoretical discussions protected by principles of free expression. And I was the one ensuring these discussions could continue by removing spam and obvious rule violations, while allowing the substantive criminal content to remain. The teacher my sister knew was just one of hundreds of people being systematically targeted through discussions on the platforms I moderated. Each day, I reviewed posts documenting surveillance of specific individuals, sharing their personal information, discussing approaches for exploiting their vulnerabilities. But what made it unbearable was understanding that my moderation work was essential to the platform's operation. The constant spam, scams, and obvious rule violations would have made the platforms unusable if moderators like me weren't filtering them out. By removing the noise, I was making it easier for users to conduct their targeted harassment and criminal planning without distraction. I tried to refuse further work, but David made it clear that wasn't an option I could simply choose. I'd been working for the platforms for months, seeing everything users discussed, making decisions about what content should remain visible. I knew too much about how they operated and what they facilitated. Walking away would mean explaining to potential future employers why I'd left such well-paid work, and it would mean losing the substantial income I'd become dependent on. I was trapped by my own complicity. I couldn't report the platforms to authorities without admitting I'd been enabling criminal activity for months. I couldn't continue moderating without accepting that I was facilitating serious harm to real people, and I couldn't simply walk away without consequences from people who had extensive documentation of my involvement in maintaining these spaces. That's when I started documenting everything I saw on the platforms, taking screenshots and keeping detailed records of the criminal discussions I was being required to allow. I told myself I was preserving evidence for eventual reporting to authorities, but really I was just trying to feel less guilty about the harm I was enabling every day. The teacher in Norfolk ended up leaving her job after the harassment became unbearable. Users on the platform celebrated their successful campaign, discussing techniques they'd used and sharing lessons learned for future targeting. I read those celebration posts and knew I'd played a role in destroying a good person's career and sense of safety. I found other cases where people I'd allowed to be discussed on the platforms had subsequently been victimized. An elderly man in Somerset, whose information had been shared in those targeting discussions, was burgled shortly afterwards. A young mother in Wales, who'd been identified as vulnerable on the platforms, experienced systematic harassment that drove her from her home. Each case made it clearer that my moderation work wasn't just facilitating abstract discussions. It was enabling real criminal activity that destroyed real lives. The theoretical framing users employed to avoid explicit rule violations was just a linguistic shield that let them coordinate actual crimes, while I helpfully removed the spam and obvious violations that might have interfered with their planning. I tried contacting the police about what I'd discovered, but explaining my role proved impossible without admitting extensive complicity. I'd been moderating platforms for months, carefully removing content that violated specific rules while allowing criminal planning to continue unimpeded. My screenshots and documentation showed my intimate involvement in maintaining spaces where serious crimes were coordinated. The officer I spoke to was professional but frank about my position. I'd knowingly worked for platforms facilitating criminal activity. Accepting substantial payment for work I must have understood was enabling harm. Cooperation might be valuable for their investigation, but I shouldn't expect immunity from prosecution for my role in the operation. I was advised to stop moderating immediately and refuse further contact with the platform administrators. But David had already anticipated that possibility. I received messages explaining that moderators who caused problems for the platforms faced serious consequences. They had extensive records of my moderation decisions, including content I'd allowed to remain that had subsequently enabled criminal activity. If I tried to report them, they'd ensure authorities understood my active role in facilitating that activity. I realized I was being blackmailed with documentation of my own moderation work. Even though I'd been following the rules I'd been hired to enforce, the records showed me making decisions that allowed criminal planning to continue. They could present me as an active facilitator of the harm these platforms enabled. That's when the harassment started in earnest. I began finding my own personal information appearing on the platforms I'd been moderating. Users discussed my work history, my address, my daily routines. They shared photographs of my flat taken from outside, discussed theoretical approaches for accessing my home, even speculated about vulnerabilities that could be exploited. I was now being subjected to the same treatment I'd been enabling for months through my moderation work. Users were documenting my life with the same methodical precision they'd applied to all their previous targets, discussing approaches for ensuring my silence about what I'd seen on their platforms. The cognitive dissonance of seeing my own information being shared in spaces I was supposed to be moderating was overwhelming. I was expected to continue removing spam and obvious rule violations from discussions about targeting me, maintaining the platform's functionality even as it facilitated my own harassment, I stopped logging into the moderation systems entirely, knowing that refusing to work would trigger the consequences David had warned about, but unable to continue enabling discussions that now directly threaten my own safety. Within days, I started receiving packages containing printed screenshots of moderation decisions I'd made, with annotations showing how those decisions had enabled specific criminal activities. The message was clear. They had comprehensive documentation of my complicity, and they'd use it to destroy my life if I caused them problems by reporting to authorities or refusing to remain silent about what I'd seen. That's when I left Norwich entirely, packing essential belongings and driving to Stoke-on-Trent, where I had no previous connections. I've been staying in this inadequate bedsit, avoiding digital traces and hoping I can disappear long enough to work out what to do next. But I know the platforms are still operating, still facilitating criminal planning and coordination, still enabling systematic targeting of vulnerable people. Other moderators have probably been recruited to replace me. People who make the same rationalizations I did about just enforcing rules and maintaining free expression. I think about that teacher in Norfolk, about the elderly man who was burgled, about all the other people whose lives were destroyed through discussions I allowed to remain visible. They trusted that online platforms had some responsibility to prevent coordination of criminal activity, that moderators would remove content that enabled serious harm. But I proved them wrong by carefully maintaining the platform's functionality, while allowing criminal planning to continue unimpeded. Every spam post I removed, every obvious violation I caught, it all made the platforms more effective at facilitating the criminal discussions I was required to ignore. The platforms taught me that moderation itself can be weaponized, that enforcing narrow technical rules while ignoring broader criminal context makes you complicit in whatever harm those platforms enable, that free expression principles can be exploited to shield criminal activity behind theoretical framing and coded language, and that once you've spent months moderating platforms you know are facilitating criminal activity, you become complicit enough that reporting them means destroying your own life along with exposing their operations. I suppose that's why I'm still sitting here in this freezing bedsit, rather than going back to police with all the evidence I preserved. Because I know that documentation implicates me as much as it exposes the platforms, and I'm not brave enough to face consequences for choices I made when I convinced myself I was just following the rules I'd been hired to enforce. All I can do is hope that someone else will eventually expose these platforms, that other moderators will find the courage I lack to report what they're enabling, despite the personal consequences, and hope that the people being targeted through discussions on those platforms find some way to protect themselves from criminal activity being coordinated in spaces that present themselves as merely facilitating controversial free expression. Because the platforms are still operating, still recruiting moderators, still facilitating systematic targeting of vulnerable people. And I helped maintain them for months, carefully removing spam and obvious violations, while allowing criminal planning to flourish unchecked. If you're a parent, this is probably going to sound completely insane, but I once left my children with someone I barely knew. Looking back, I honestly don't know what I was thinking. As you can probably imagine, I'm still dealing with the consequences now, months later. It wasn't some random person off the street. I had references. I'd met her twice before the first proper babysitting session. Everything seemed completely legitimate. But legitimate doesn't mean what I thought it meant. And those evenings when I thought my kids were safely tucked up in bed while I was at work are apparently documented in ways that make me feel sick every time I think about it. documented and sold to people who paid for access to footage I never knew was being recorded. Footage that continues to exist somewhere I'll never be able to find or delete. I'm a midwife working at a hospital in Bristol. Been doing it for around 12 years now. I'm a single mum to 2 children, Oliver, who's 8, and Emma, who's 6. Their dad left when Emma was a baby, and I've managed mostly on my own since then, juggling shifts at the hospital with childcare arrangements that are always slightly more complicated than I'd like. My mum helps when she can, and the kids go to after-school club most days, but occasionally I need evening coverage when my shifts run late or I'm called in unexpectedly. Last year, I started using a babysitter I'd found through a local childcare website. Her name was Kelly, early 20s, studying early years education at college. She had good references from other families, a clean DBS check, and when I met her for coffee to discuss what I needed, she seemed responsible and genuinely interested in childcare as a career. We arranged a trial evening where she'd look after the kids, whilst I went to the cinema with a friend, just to see how everyone got on. The evening went perfectly. The children liked her. She followed all my instructions about bedtime routines and house rules. And when I came home, everything was tidy, and the kids were asleep. Kelly was professional and pleasant, happy to answer questions about how the evening had gone. I felt I'd found someone reliable, which was a relief given how difficult it can be to find good childcare. Over the following months, Kelly babysat for me around once or twice a week, usually on evenings when I had late shifts or training sessions at the hospital. The routine became comfortable and familiar. I'd leave detailed instructions about dinner and bedtime. Kelly would arrive punctually, and I'd come home to sleeping children and a tidy house. She'd update me on how the evening had gone, any issues or funny moments, and I'd pay her the agreed rate plus a bit extra for being so reliable. The children adored her. Oliver would ask when Kelly was coming again, and Emma started talking about her like a favorite aunt. Kelly brought craft activities and games, helped with homework, seemed genuinely engaged with the kids rather than just watching television whilst they entertained themselves. I felt fortunate to have found someone so capable and caring. Around 4 months into this arrangement, I started noticing Kelly asking more questions about our routines and home setup. What time did I usually get home from late shifts? Did we have any security cameras or alarms? Where did I keep important documents and valuables? She framed these questions casually, explaining she was writing an essay for college about household safety and childcare responsibilities, but something about the questions made me slightly uncomfortable. I answered vaguely, not wanting to seem distrustful, but also not wanting to provide detailed information about security measures or where I kept things. Kelly didn't push for more specific answers, and the questions stopped after a week or so. I convinced myself I'd been oversensitive, that they really were just for a college assignment. Then one evening, I came home from a shift to find Kelly looking flustered. She explained that Emma had been upset at bedtime and had cried for nearly an hour before finally settling. This was unusual. Emma was generally an easy child who went to bed without fuss. When I checked on her, she was sleeping soundly and seemed fine. I didn't think too much about it, assuming she'd just been tired and emotional. The following week, Oliver mentioned casually that Kelly had been using the computer in my bedroom. He said she'd been up there for ages whilst they were watching television, and he'd gone to find her because he wanted help with something. I asked him what Kelly had been doing on the computer, and he shrugged and said she'd closed the screen quickly when he came in. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. There was no reason for Kelly to be using my computer, and certainly no reason for her to be doing so in my bedroom rather than in the living room where the children could see her. I checked my computer that evening but couldn't see anything obviously wrong or accessed. My files looked undisturbed. My browser history showed nothing unusual. I told myself Oliver had probably misunderstood what he'd seen. But I started paying more attention after that, looking for anything that seemed off or inconsistent with how I'd left things. I noticed small changes. A drawer in my bedroom dresser that I was sure I'd closed was slightly open. Papers on my desk rearranged slightly differently than I usually positioned them. The spare room door standing open when I generally kept it shut. I also noticed that my laptop seemed to run slower than usual, and occasionally the fan would come on even when I wasn't running any demanding programs. I asked a colleague at work who was more technically minded to have a look at it, and she found several programs running in the background that I'd never installed. Remote access software, screen recording applications, things that would allow someone to monitor or control the computer without the owner knowing. She removed the software and asked how it might have gotten there. I immediately thought of Kelly using the computer, though I couldn't understand why a babysitter would install spyware on a client's laptop. My colleague suggested it might be part of identity theft or fraud, gathering personal information that could be used to access accounts or steal money. I confronted Kelly the next time she came to babysit, asking directly if she'd been using my computer and whether she knew anything about software I hadn't installed. She seemed genuinely confused and denied using the computer at all, saying Oliver must have been mistaken. I wanted to believe her, but the software installation aligned too closely with when Oliver had mentioned seeing her in my bedroom. I told Kelly I didn't need her services anymore, making up an excuse about my mum having more availability to help with childcare. She seemed disappointed, but accepted it professionally. I paid her for the evening and she left, and I felt relieved to have ended the arrangement before anything worse happened. About 2 weeks later, I received an anonymous email containing a link and a message saying I should see what had been happening in my home. Every instinct told me it was malicious, probably spam or a virus, but the timing after ending things with Kelly made me curious despite myself. I showed the email to my technically minded colleague, and she helped me access the link safely through isolated systems. The link led to a website on the dark web, a marketplace specializing in what they called domestic surveillance content. The site was organized into categories by household type and composition, with search functions allowing users to filter by specific criteria. My household was listed there under single-parent families with young children. The listing included dozens of video files, all recorded in my home during evenings when Kelly had been babysitting. The videos showed my children going about their evening routines, eating dinner, playing games, getting ready for bed. But they also showed footage from my bedroom, my office space, private areas Kelly had accessed whilst the children were occupied. Some videos showed Kelly going through drawers and cupboards, photographing documents, copying files from my computer. Others showed her installing small cameras in various rooms, in smoke detectors, in electrical sockets, in decorative items on shelves. The videos were professionally edited and organized, clearly intended for sale rather than just personal collection. The marketplace listing described what buyers could expect: authentic footage of family life, children's bedtime routines, private spaces documented without the family's knowledge. The listing emphasized that recording was ongoing, with new content uploaded regularly. Buyers could purchase individual videos or subscribe for continuous access to new footage as it was recorded. The view counter showed hundreds of people had accessed my listing. The subscription data indicated around 30 different users had paid for ongoing access to footage from my home. Comments beneath the listing discussed the content in ways that made me feel physically ill. People praising the quality of the videos, requesting specific types of footage, discussing which rooms and routines were most interesting to watch. What made it worse was realizing the cameras Kelly had installed were presumably still active. Even though she was no longer babysitting, the devices were still recording and transmitting footage of my family's private life. My children getting ready for school, bedtime routines I thought were completely private, everyday moments that were being watched and discussed by strangers who'd paid for access. I contacted the police immediately. They took it extremely seriously, sending officers to search my house for hidden cameras. It took most of a day, but they found 6 devices, 1 in the living room electrical socket, 1 in the hallway smoke detector, 1 in each child's bedroom hidden in nightlights, 1 in my bedroom ceiling fixture, and 1 in the bathroom extractor fan. All of them had been installed during evenings when Kelly had been supposedly supervising my children. The police arrested Kelly and seized her computer and phone. They found extensive evidence of her involvement in creating and selling surveillance footage from multiple households. She'd been operating this scheme for over 2 years, targeting single parents through childcare websites, gaining access to homes through legitimate babysitting arrangements, and installing cameras to record family life for sale on dark web marketplaces. The investigation revealed at least 20 other families whose homes had been surveilled the same way. All single parents, mostly mothers, all found through childcare websites where Kelly had created profiles with fake references and stolen DBS certificates. She'd refined her approach over time, learning which types of households generated the most interest from buyers and which rooms produced the most valuable footage. Kelly was prosecuted and received a prison sentence, but the damage was irreversible. The footage she'd recorded and sold existed in private collections of people who downloaded it before the marketplace was shut down. Months of my children's lives, documented without their knowledge or consent, potentially being shared through networks I'd never access or control. The psychological impact on the children has been difficult to manage. Oliver is old enough to understand that someone bad had been watching them, though I've tried to shield him from the full details. Emma doesn't fully grasp what happened, just knows that Kelly won't be coming back and that we have new rules about privacy and safety. Both of them have nightmares occasionally, feelings of being watched that I understand completely because I have them too. I've installed proper security systems now, check every smoke detector and electrical fixture regularly, maintain hypervigilance about who has access to my home. But I know that footage of my children still exists somewhere. Videos of bedtime routines, bath times, private family moments that were recorded and sold to strangers who viewed my children's innocence as content worth purchasing. The detective assigned to my case walked me through what they'd found on Kelly's devices. She'd been meticulous in her documentation, keeping detailed records of which families she targeted, what times cameras were most productive, which types of content generated the most buyer interest. She'd organized everything like a business, with spreadsheets tracking revenue from different households and notes about which families were worth maintaining surveillance on long term. My household had been particularly valuable to her because of the children's ages and our predictable evening routines. The detective explained, with obvious discomfort, that footage of young children in domestic settings was highly sought after on these marketplaces, not necessarily for explicitly inappropriate purposes in every case, though that was certainly part of it, but also for people who were interested in observing family dynamics and children's natural behavior when they thought they were unobserved. That explanation didn't make me feel any better. Whether buyers were watching my children for explicitly predatory reasons or for some other disturbing purpose didn't change the fundamental violation. My children's private lives had been commodified and sold, their innocence converted into entertainment for strangers whose interest in them was inherently wrong, regardless of their specific motivations. The investigation also revealed that Kelly had been refining her techniques based on feedback from buyers. The marketplace where she sold the footage included messaging systems where subscribers could request specific types of content or suggest better camera placements. She'd used these requests to improve her surveillance methods, positioning cameras based on what buyers wanted to see, adjusting her babysitting routines to capture particular moments that had been requested. One particularly disturbing message thread discussed bedtime routines, with a subscriber asking if Kelly could record bath time more consistently. She'd responded that she'd work on getting better access to that content, and subsequent footage showed she'd installed an additional camera in the bathroom specifically to fulfill that request. She treated my children like actors in a production she was directing, manipulating our family routines to create content that would satisfy paying customers. The police found similar message threads about other families Kelly had surveilled, requests for specific angles, particular daily activities, certain times of day when children were most natural and unguarded. She'd accommodated these requests systematically, treating the surveillance operation like any other customer service business where satisfying client preferences was essential to maintaining revenue. What made it even worse was discovering how Kelly had gained access to some of her information about our household before even meeting me. The childcare website where I'd found her required parents to create profiles with details about their family situation, children's ages, typical schedules, and specific childcare needs. Kelly had been systematically collecting this information from parent profiles, using it to target families that matched the preferences of her marketplace subscribers. She'd known before our first meeting that I was a single mother with 2 young children, that I worked irregular hospital hours, that I needed evening coverage regularly. She'd known my children's names and ages, roughly where we lived, what my childcare budget was likely to be. All of that information had been freely provided by me through the website, never imagining it would be used to identify my family as ideal targets for commercial surveillance. The technical analysis of the cameras Kelly had installed revealed they were more sophisticated than typical consumer spy cameras. They included motion-activated recording that saved storage space by only capturing footage when people were present. They had night vision capability for recording in dark rooms. They could be remotely accessed and controlled, allowing Kelly to adjust settings or review footage without physically returning to the homes where she'd installed them. Most disturbing was the discovery that Kelly could watch the camera feeds in real time from her phone while she was physically present in my home. The detective showed me footage that Kelly herself had recorded using her phone, showing the view from her perspective while she babysat. In several videos, she was clearly watching the live feed from the bedroom camera while sitting downstairs with the children, monitoring me when I came home early or went upstairs to check on something. She'd been watching me without my knowledge whilst pretending to interact normally, seeing everything I did in private spaces whilst maintaining the performance of a trustworthy babysitter. The sophistication of the operation and the coldness of that deception made it clear this wasn't impulsive or opportunistic. It was calculated, systematic, professional in its execution, even though its purpose was unconscionable. The court proceedings were difficult to endure. Kelly's defense tried to minimize what she'd done, arguing that she'd never physically harmed any children, and that the surveillance footage wasn't explicitly inappropriate. The prosecution had to explain in painful detail how the footage had been marketed and what kinds of people had purchased access to it, making the implicit threats to children's safety horrifyingly clear, even without physical contact. Several other families whose homes Kelly had surveilled attended the trial. We formed an uncomfortable community of shared experience, united by having trusted the wrong person with access to our children and homes. Some had discovered the surveillance through the investigation into Kelly's activities, never having suspected anything was wrong until police contacted them. Others had noticed oddities like I had, but hadn't connected them to their babysitter until it was too late. One mother described finding cameras in her children's bedrooms years after Kelly had last babysat for them. The devices had continued recording and transmitting long after Kelly had moved on to other families, creating an archive of footage spanning the children's development from toddlers to primary school age. The breadth of that violation, the years of surveillance that had continued invisibly, was staggering to contemplate. Another family had discovered that footage of their children had been distributed beyond the original marketplace Kelly used. Screenshots and video clips had appeared on other websites, reposted and shared by people who'd initially purchased them through Kelly's listings. The footage had taken on a life of its own, spreading through networks the family could never fully map or eliminate. Their children's images permanently circulating in spaces they'd never be able to control. Kelly received a substantial prison sentence, but we all knew it wouldn't undo what had been done. The footage would continue existing after her release. The violation would persist long after she'd served her time. The families she targeted would carry the knowledge of what happened for the rest of our lives, and our children would eventually need to be told enough of the truth to understand why we're so careful about privacy and security. I've had to explain to Oliver and Emma in age-appropriate terms that someone we trusted did something very wrong. Oliver understands that Kelly was recording us and that those recordings were seen by strangers who shouldn't have had access to them. Emma understands that Kelly wasn't who we thought she was and that she did bad things that mean we have to be more careful now. Neither of them knows the full extent of it. The marketplace listings and subscriber counts and ongoing distribution of their images. I hope they never need to know those details. What haunts me most is thinking about those 30 subscribers who paid for ongoing access to footage from my home. Who were they? Why were they interested in watching my family specifically? What did they do with the footage they downloaded? The police investigation identified some of them, resulting in additional arrests for possession of inappropriate material, but many remained anonymous. The architecture of the dark web marketplace Kelly used made it difficult to trace all subscribers or determine what they'd done with the content after downloading it. I think about them sometimes, these faceless strangers who paid money to watch my children sleep, to observe their bedtime routines, to see private family moments that should never have been shared. Some were probably local, living near enough that they might have seen my children at school or in shops, recognizing them from footage they'd purchased. Others were probably scattered across the country or internationally, interested in my family for reasons I'll never understand and don't want to imagine. The uncertainty is corrosive, not knowing who saw what or when, or what they did with the footage, or whether they're still watching material they downloaded before the marketplace was shut down. The investigation revealed that Kelly's operation had been running for over 2 years and had surveilled around 20 families in that time. The amount of footage she'd sold was substantial. Thousands of hours of domestic surveillance showing children and families in their most private moments. I also think about the other families Kelly targeted, particularly those who never discovered what happened. The investigation identified 20 households where cameras were found, but Kelly's record suggested she'd surveilled more than that. Either the cameras had been removed by Kelly herself when she moved on to other targets, or they remained undiscovered in homes where families had no idea they were being watched. How many children's lives were documented and sold without their parents ever knowing? The psychological impact on my children has been harder to manage than the practical security measures. Oliver developed significant anxiety about being watched, checking his room repeatedly for cameras, asking questions about whether people could see him through windows or electronics. Emma became clingy and fearful of being left with anyone other than immediate family. Her trust in caregivers shattered by the realization that someone she'd liked and trusted had been doing something harmful. We've been through counseling, both individually and as a family. The therapist has helped us process what happened and develop strategies for feeling safe again. But recovery is slow and uneven, with setbacks triggered by seemingly random events, a smoke detector beeping to signal low battery, a nightlight that reminds them of the ones that contained cameras, a news story about surveillance or privacy invasion. I gave someone access to my children and my home based on references that turned out to be fake and a professional manner that was entirely performance. That decision led to months of secret surveillance. My children's lives sold to strangers as entertainment. Permanent footage that continues to exist in collections I'll never locate. The trust I extended to Kelly wasn't unreasonable or negligent. I did what parents are supposed to do, checking credentials and meeting potential caregivers before allowing them access to my children. But it wasn't enough, because Kelly's entire presentation was designed to exploit exactly that kind of reasonable parental diligence. That's what I think about now when I see babysitters advertised on childcare websites. Not whether they're qualified or experienced, but whether they're installing more than trust whilst parents are away. Whether the families who hire them realize their private lives might become products sold in hidden corners of the internet to people whose interest in children isn't innocent. Whether other parents understand that credentials can be faked, references can be manufactured, and professional manner can mask predatory intent. The childcare website where I found Kelly has implemented new verification procedures since the investigation revealed how she'd operated. They now require video verification calls and more rigorous background checks. They've added warnings about protecting family privacy and recommendations for monitoring caregivers. But these measures feel inadequate, given what happened. Reactive rather than preventive. Closing the door after too many families had already been violated. I left my children with someone I barely knew. Just a babysitter who seemed professional, who had references I didn't verify properly, who seemed to genuinely care about my kids. That trust led to a betrayal I'll never fully recover from, to footage that can't be retrieved, to a loss of innocence for my children that no prison sentence can restore. The guilt of that sits with me constantly. The knowledge that my decision to trust Kelly exposed my children to something I should have protected them from. We're supposedly safe now. The cameras are gone. Kelly is imprisoned. The marketplace was shut down. But somewhere online, videos of my children exist. Their bedtime stories, their bath times, their innocent moments of childhood, all documented and distributed to people I'll never identify. And that knowledge will haunt me for the rest of my life. A permanent weight I'll carry, a violation that can never be undone. No matter how many security systems I install or how carefully I vet future caregivers, that's the reality of what happened when I hired a babysitter I found online. Not a tragic accident or an unforeseeable risk, but a systematic exploitation of parental trust, by someone who'd refined their predatory approach over years of targeting vulnerable families. My mistake wasn't unique or particularly careless. It was predictable, which is why Kelly's operation was so successful and why other families continue to be at risk from people operating similar schemes right now. The footage exists. The violation is permanent. And somewhere, someone is probably watching videos of my children at this very moment, footage they purchased or downloaded or received from someone else who'd subscribed to Kelly's marketplace listings. That thought makes it hard to breathe sometimes. The knowledge that my children's privacy was stolen and sold and continues to be violated by strangers whose faces I'll never see and whose motivations I'll never understand. That's what one bad decision cost us, and that's a price we'll be paying for the rest of our lives. The weight loss supplement I'd been testing for a product review company turned out to contain something that definitely wasn't meant for dieting. It seemed like easy money when I first saw the advert on a freelance job site. Testmart Solutions needed people to try various health and wellness products, then write honest reviews about their experiences. Each review pays £30, with flexible deadlines and the option to work from home. Perfect for someone juggling university coursework with mounting student debt. My first assignment was straightforward enough. A vitamin supplement that claimed to boost energy levels. I took it for 2 weeks, documented any effects I noticed, and submitted a detailed review covering everything from packaging to results. The process was professional and the payment arrived promptly. The second assignment was where things started getting odd. I noticed another supplement, this time marketed for weight loss, but its packaging looked different from anything I had seen in regular stores. No brand name I recognized, minimal labeling, and ingredients listed in ways that seemed deliberately vague. The company explained that they specialized in testing products before they reached mainstream markets, which was why the packaging looked unfamiliar. Early-stage supplements often had basic labeling, while manufacturers finalized their branding and regulatory approvals. I started taking the weight loss pills as instructed, documenting everything from appetite changes to energy levels. The effects were immediate and dramatic, much more significant than you'd expect from any legitimate dietary supplement. Within days, I was experiencing symptoms that seemed excessive for something meant to support healthy weight management. Severe appetite suppression, irregular heartbeat, difficulty sleeping, and mood changes that felt chemically induced rather than natural responses to dietary changes. These side effects are more commonly associated with prescription medications than with over-the-counter wellness products. When I reported these concerning symptoms to Testmart Solutions, they assured me that strong effects were normal for concentrated supplements and that documenting adverse reactions was actually valuable data for their client companies. They encouraged me to continue the testing period and record detailed information about all symptoms I experienced. But the symptoms were becoming serious enough to affect my daily functioning. I was losing weight rapidly, struggling to concentrate during lectures, and experiencing physical reactions that suggested the supplement contained much more than basic dietary ingredients. I decided to research the specific compounds listed on the packaging, hoping to understand what was causing such extreme effects. Most ingredients were listed using chemical names rather than common terms, making it difficult to identify what I was actually consuming. When I finally managed to trace some of the chemical references, I found that several weren't approved dietary supplements at all. Some appeared to be pharmaceutical compounds that required prescriptions, while others seemed to be industrial chemicals with no legitimate use in nutrition products. I realized I wasn't testing dietary supplements for consumer reviews. I was unknowingly participating in illegal drug trials, consuming experimental compounds that hadn't been approved for human consumption. The dramatic weight loss effects weren't from legitimate dietary ingredients, but from potentially dangerous chemicals that were being tested on unsuspecting volunteers who thought they were trying normal wellness products. When I tried to stop taking the supplements and withdraw from the testing program, Testmart Solutions expressed concern about incomplete data collection and offered premium payments for continuing the full testing protocol. They emphasized that partial testing periods weren't useful for their research purposes and that discontinuing treatments abruptly could be medically risky after the physiological changes I'd already experienced. The pressure to continue felt excessive for what should have been voluntary product testing. It seemed more like concern about losing test subjects from medical experiments that required systematic data collection to be scientifically valid. I attempted to research Testmart Solutions more thoroughly and found that while they maintained professional business registration, there was minimal information about their actual operations or the companies they claimed to represent. Most legitimate product testing services had clear connections to recognized manufacturers and transparent processes for ensuring participants' safety. Testmart operated with much less oversight than would be expected for a company handling potentially harmful substances. More troubling was evidence that some of the compounds I'd been consuming had been connected to serious health problems in other contexts. Industrial chemicals that had caused organ damage, pharmaceutical ingredients that had been banned due to dangerous side effects, even substances that were known to be addictive or psychologically harmful. The product testing wasn't evaluating consumer wellness supplements. It was systematic human experimentation using compounds that couldn't be tested through legitimate medical research due to safety concerns and regulatory restrictions. But by the time I understood what was happening, I'd been consuming unknown chemicals for several weeks and experiencing physiological changes that might have long-term health consequences regardless of whether I continued participating in the testing program. The detailed health information I'd provided during the application process would also make it difficult to prove that any subsequent medical problems were caused by the experimental compounds rather than pre-existing conditions or lifestyle factors. Meanwhile, the illegal drug testing operation was probably continuing with other participants who were unaware they were consuming dangerous experimental substances while thinking they were earning money through legitimate product reviews. People seeking flexible part-time work were being systematically recruited to serve as test subjects for pharmaceutical experiments that violated every principle of informed consent and participant safety. The supplement testing I thought would provide easy income while contributing to consumer product development had instead made me an unwitting participant in medical experiments that could cause permanent damage to my health. But the most disturbing realization was that this recruitment method was probably being used to target vulnerable populations who needed money and might be less likely to question unusual side effects or seek medical attention for problems caused by experimental compounds. Students, unemployed people, and others dealing with financial pressures were being systematically exploited to provide human test subjects for illegal pharmaceutical research that couldn't be conducted through legitimate medical institutions. I never completed another product testing assignment, but I remained concerned about the long-term health effects of the experimental compounds I'd consumed and the possibility that the illegal research operation would continue targeting other vulnerable people. The casual way Testmart Solutions had recruited participants and administered potentially dangerous substances suggested that illegal human experimentation was being conducted on a significant scale by people who understood how to exploit financial desperation while maintaining plausible deniability about their activities. When I eventually sought medical advice about the symptoms I'd experienced, My doctor was disturbed by the descriptions of the compounds I'd been given and recommended comprehensive testing to check for organ damage or other long-term effects that might not become apparent until months or years after exposure to the experimental chemicals. I've been sitting on this story for nearly 3 years now. Every time I consider sharing it, something stops me. Maybe fear, maybe guilt, maybe the knowledge that once it's out there, I can't take it back. But after what happened last Tuesday, I need to get this off my chest. Some things you just can't explain to someone who hasn't seen what the internet really hides. It started with boredom, honestly. Nothing dramatic. No tragic backstory, just a guy with too much time on his hands and a fancy gaming PC that could handle pretty much anything. I'd recently moved to Bristol for a job in IT security, ironically enough. I was living alone for the first time in one of those cookie-cutter apartment blocks they keep throwing up near city centres. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbour sneeze, but somehow I still felt isolated. My friends were all back in Birmingham, and I wasn't great at the whole making new connections thing. So I spent a lot of nights at home, gaming or browsing the web. I'd known about the dark web for years, of course. Anyone in IT security does. I'd even accessed it a few times for research purposes during uni, checking out how certain black markets operated so we could better understand security vulnerabilities. Nothing sinister, just academic curiosity. But on this particular night, a rainy Tuesday in October, I was especially restless. I'd finished a 12-hour shift sorting out a ransomware issue for a client, and my brain was still buzzing even though my body was exhausted. That weird combination where you're too tired to do anything productive but too wired to sleep. So I set up a secure browser, connected through a couple of VPNs, force of habit from work, and started browsing. At first, it was just the usual stuff. Marketplaces selling drugs, forums discussing privacy, sites offering counterfeit documents. I remember the soft blue glow of my monitor reflecting on my coffee mug, the one with the faded Liverpool FC logo that I'd had since uni. My eyes were getting heavy, and I was about to call it a night when a notification popped up on one of the forums I'd been browsing. Someone had messaged me directly, which was unusual. I'd been lurking, not posting. I wasn't even using a regular username, just a randomly generated string of characters. The message was simple, asking if I was looking for something specific. I almost ignored it. My IT security brain was throwing up red flags like crazy. But there was that curiosity again, that same itch that had gotten me browsing the dark web in the first place. I responded non-committally, saying I was just exploring. The conversation that followed seemed benign enough, just someone being friendly, asking about my interests, how long I'd been on the forum. Looking back, they were clearly probing to see if I was law enforcement, but at the time, it just felt like casual chat. I was distracted anyway, half watching a YouTube video in another window, and occasionally getting up to stretch my legs or refill my coffee. My flat had that faintly musty smell it always got when it rained. I never could figure out where the dampness was coming from. About 20 minutes into the conversation, they shared a link. Said it might interest me based on what we'd been discussing, which had drifted to the topic of how much of what people claimed about the dark web was urban legend versus reality. I hesitated. Clicking random links on the dark web is basically security suicide 101. But they mentioned it was a forum specifically discussing the myths and realities of services for hire on the dark web, supposedly debunking the hitman for hire sites as scams which they mostly are. I was genuinely interested from a professional standpoint. I'd been teaching a module on digital security that touched on exactly this subject. My finger hovered over the trackpad. I really should have known better. I'd literally spent that morning cleaning up after a ransomware attack that started with someone clicking a suspicious link. But it was late, I was tired, and my judgment was compromised. I clicked. It took me to what looked like another forum, but more sophisticated than most dark websites. Clean design, proper formatting. None of the clunky early 2000s aesthetics that dominate most .onion domains. I had to create an account to view most of the content, which again set off alarm bells, but I used all my usual precautions: temporary email, generated password, fake details. The verification process was more thorough than usual, requiring me to complete a series of puzzles rather than just clicking a link. That should have been another warning sign, but I was mildly impressed by the security measures. Professional curiosity, I suppose. Once in, I browsed a few threads. It seemed legitimate enough. Discussions about various dark web services, debates about which ones were scams, analyses of how law enforcement tracked these kinds of operations. There was a whole section dedicated to service provider vetting that claimed to verify whether sellers of various illegal services were legitimate or not. I remember my eyes starting to sting from staring at the screen too long, and I rubbed them, noticing the stubble on my chin. I hadn't shaved in days, hadn't really needed to, since I was working remotely that week. Then I noticed a locked thread titled Verification Events. It had thousands of views, but only a handful of replies. Something about the clinical terminology made me uneasy, but I was already in too deep. I clicked it, only to get a message that this section was for verified members only. Below, it was a link to apply for verification. The application form was brief, asking about my interests and what I hoped to gain from verification. I was vague, saying I was researching the reality behind dark web legends for academic purposes. I didn't expect anything to come of it. These exclusive forums usually ignored new members, so I was surprised when, less than 5 minutes later, I received a notification that my application was being processed and I should remain online. While waiting, I got up to use the bathroom. The linoleum was cold under my feet. I kept meaning to buy a bath mat, but somehow never remembered when I was actually out shopping. When I came back, there was a new notification. My application had been provisionally approved, pending a demonstration verification session that would begin in 10 minutes. There was a countdown timer and instructions to ensure my connection was stable and secure. I should have logged off right then. Every instinct I developed over years in IT security was screaming at me to disconnect. But there was a strange sense of detachment, almost like I was watching someone else make these decisions. I told myself it was just professional curiosity, that I'd watch the demonstration, gather information about how these scams operated, and then report it through proper channels. I even opened a text document to take notes, as if that somehow made what I was doing legitimate research rather than dangerous stupidity. The countdown reached 0, and my screen changed to what looked like a video streaming interface with a chat panel to the right. A message appeared stating that the demonstration would begin shortly, and that this was a proof of capability session for new clients. No interaction or bidding would be permitted during the demonstration. This was observation only. The video began playing. At first, it showed an ordinary street somewhere urban. Could have been anywhere in Britain or Europe. Brick buildings, parked cars, streetlights casting orange pools on wet pavement. The camera appeared to be stationary but high quality. possibly mounted somewhere overlooking the street. A timestamp in the corner showed it was live footage, just minutes behind real time. I remember noticing condensation forming on my window as the rain outside grew heavier, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the building across the street. For several minutes, nothing happened. The chat remained quiet, except for occasional messages confirming that members were connected and viewing. Then a car pulled up, a dark-colored sedan, nothing distinctive. A man got out, looked to be in his 40s, wearing a business suit. He locked the car and started walking down the street, checking his phone. The camera followed him, which meant it wasn't stationary as I'd first thought. Someone was controlling it remotely, tracking this random businessman as he walked. I felt the first real stab of unease. This wasn't a demonstration of a scam. This was surveillance of an actual person. A message appeared in the chat, giving a brief profile of the man. His name, occupation, home address, details about his family, and below that, the reason he'd been selected. Allegations of embezzlement from a company pension fund. Money that belonged to people who had worked their whole lives for a secure retirement. The message explained that this was a contracted demonstration, the fee already paid by former employees who had lost their savings. The clinical tone made it all the more disturbing, like reading a weather report that happened to be describing a hurricane heading straight for you. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be staged, an elaborate performance to convince potential clients that they were legitimate. I almost convinced myself of that until the camera angle changed, and I saw a new figure enter the frame. Someone wearing dark clothing and a nondescript cap, walking on the opposite side of the street in the same direction as the businessman. The chat became more active. Comments appeared noting the operator's approach, discussing the technique being demonstrated. Some mentioned previous demonstrations they'd witnessed, comparing methodologies. I felt sick but couldn't look away. It was like watching a nature documentary where you know the gazelle is about to be taken down by a lion, but it's happening in slow motion. The businessman stopped at a corner, waiting to cross. The operator casually crossed the street, ending up just behind him. They were now both waiting for the traffic light to change. I remember holding my breath, my coffee forgotten and growing cold beside me. The ticking of my cheap wall clock seemed abnormally loud in the silence of my flat. When it happened, it was so quick I almost missed it. As the light changed and people began to cross, the operator moved directly behind the businessman. There was a slight motion, just a small movement of their arm. And then they were walking past, continuing on as the businessman took a few more steps and then suddenly stumbled. At first, it looked like he'd simply tripped. He put his hand against the building to steady himself, then touched his side where the operator had been. His expression changed from confusion to alarm. He looked around, seemingly trying to call out, but no one stopped. He slid down the wall to a sitting position, his briefcase still clutched in one hand. The camera stayed on him as people walked past, most not even noticing the man sitting against the wall. One woman paused, seemed to ask if he was all right, but then moved on when he waved her away. It took less than 3 minutes before his movement stopped completely. Not a single person realized what had happened. To them, it probably just looked like a drunk or someone feeling unwell. The operator was long gone, not even in frame anymore. The camera lingered on the businessman for another minute before the feed cut to black. A message appeared thanking viewers for attending the demonstration and stating that verification of new members had been completed. Those who wished to inquire about services now had access to the necessary channels. I closed my laptop immediately. I felt cold all over. my hands shaking so badly I could barely stand up. I just watched someone being murdered in real time. There was no question in my mind anymore that it was staged. The clinical efficiency, the complete lack of drama, the ordinary setting, it was all too real. I spent the rest of the night pacing my flat, desperately trying to figure out what to do. Go to the police and tell them what? That I'd witnessed a murder somewhere in an unnamed city, committed by someone I couldn't identify, against a victim whose name I only knew from an anonymous forum post. I had no proof, no recording. I hadn't thought to capture the stream, and even if I had, I'd have to admit to being in a place I should never have been. I decided to wait until morning to see if there was any news about a businessman found dead in the street. I checked every news site I could think of, searched for any reports of unexpected deaths or murders. Nothing. Either it hadn't been reported yet, or it had happened somewhere whose local news I couldn't access, or the thought that kept creeping back despite my attempts to suppress it. They were efficient enough to have removed the body before it was discovered. For days afterward, I was a wreck. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly. I kept checking the forum, but my account had been deactivated. The link I'd been sent no longer worked. It was as if the entire thing had never existed. I considered anonymous tips to various police departments, but had no idea where to even begin. Which jurisdiction? What details could I provide that wouldn't immediately be dismissed as a hoax or the ravings of a paranoid mind? Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe it had been elaborate theatre after all. A convincing performance designed to scam people out of money for hitman services that would never be delivered. The alternative was too horrible to contemplate, that I had witnessed an actual murder and done nothing about it. I moved flats the next month, telling myself it was because I'd found a better place closer to work. In reality, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I opened my laptop, I imagined someone on the other end monitoring my activity. I changed my phone number, created new email accounts, scrubbed my online presence as much as possible. Professional paranoia turned up to 11. Life gradually returned to something resembling normal. I dated, made a few friends, even got promoted at work. The memory remained, but it became easier to dismiss as a bizarre experience that couldn't possibly have been what it seemed. Until last Tuesday, I was working late, finishing up a security audit for a client, when an email arrived. No subject line sent to my personal account. The new one I'd created after that night. The sender's address was a string of random characters. The message contained only a link and the words, "We've missed your observations. A new demonstration is scheduled." Below it was my home address, my current address, not the flat where I'd been that night 3 years ago. They'd found me. They'd been watching me all along. I've been staying at a hotel since then, paid in cash. I bought a new laptop that I've never connected to any of my accounts. I'm writing this as a record, a warning maybe, though I don't know who it will reach or how. If you're reading this, remember, the dark web isn't just a playground for curious minds or a marketplace for illegal goods. There are corners of it where the darkest human impulses aren't just fantasies, but services rendered with terrifying efficiency. And once you've seen them, they've seen you too. My hotel room door just rattled, like someone trying the handle. The reception desk isn't answering my call. I think I've run out of places to hide.